the first are kind of dealing with questions about reading, resolute reading, and kind of how you approach working with texts. The second, of course, these are all interconnected categories, but broadly dealing with writing, right? So certain kind of the way you present your thoughts. The third, how you situate yourself kind of historically. So with respect to traditions, I know in the like emergence of the analytic tradition as a form of philosophical self-consciousness, you talk a lot about traditions, and so that, and then the next it's a question of very closely related to that influence, and this, you know, I guess situating yourself with respect to particular figures. So that's kind of the outline. And the idea is, you know, just kind of start getting at some general, you know, stuff going on here. Which, again, we really appreciate your work. Very happy to have you. Thank you so much.
Sounds like a great plan.
Great.
Thanks for putting so much thought into this in advance. That's great.
We got agreeing to do it. We're really happy. So Braeden, you want to take the first kind of round, or, you know, punch? Yeah.
Yeah. So I think the first question, as Nate said, is about sort of reading text in general and about resolute reading in particular. So I think, you know, one thing that we noticed about your work is that, you know, you take reading people very seriously: James, Royce, Wittgenstein, Kierkegaard, Putnam, McDowell, and so on. So could you maybe talk a bit about how you approach working with text in general?
I'd be glad to. Maybe I'm getting over case of the COVID, so I still have a little bit of a cough, so I apologize for that. I'll try. I'll mute myself when you're talking, so it doesn't you know, obscure that. But let me know if I forget to unmute myself, and I apologize if I occasionally cough at you.
Sorry.
So yeah. So let me first say something about you know, my dissatisfactions maybe with, you know, ways of reading texts that, you know, are out there. I mean, it's not that I think they're just bad, but I think it's, you know, so anyhow, something I'm reacting to that led to my then trying to come up with a different way, and then we can talk about what that is. So I mean, I think when I was, you know, myself in, you know, undergraduate and graduate school and coming up in philosophy, I was kind of struck by how there were kind of two ways of like writing about texts. And they there was sort of no middle ground, and you could kind of do one or the other. And one was a kind of way I learned from analytic philosophers, including some I admired, which was you know, you might call a certain kind of unscrupulous opportunism. You know, it's like, you know, you pick up Kant or William James or whoever, and you just look for cool ideas in them. You know, you just look for interesting ideas, and if there's some idea that you think they have that you haven't thought of, or it makes you think of something, then you kind of like spell out what it is. But it isn't really controlled by any genuine aspiration to like fidelity to what that thinker thought. I mean, you know, there's a way in which, you know, at the exegetical or historical dimension of what you're doing, you just have a license to print money, you know, so, you know, you're right. And, you know, I thought Richard Rorty was, you know, extreme example of this. You know, he was somebody who worked a lot with other texts and so forth and had things to say and got people very excited, but, you know, he'd say, and James says, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, this is, you know, what Rorty wants James to be saying, you know, and really, there's only just a few quotations kind of sloshing around his head. And, you know, if you point out to Dick Rorty, you know, back in the day, well, what about this passage and that passage and that passage? You just say, oh, that's the bad James, you know, the good James person, and this is, and then, you know, you point out more things, and it could like start to look like quantity wise, you know, a vast amount of the actual Jamesian continent of James's corpus is all the bad James, but like there's this good James, and that's what he wanted. And you know, in a way, because he was more interested in text and representing himself as doing something hermeneutic, that was kind of a little bit more awkward for him than it was for a lot of analytic philosophers who still kind of proceeded in very much that way. I mean, Rorty wouldn't have liked to be told this, but he's just incredibly, very much an analytic philosopher in the way he read text, even though he sort of trying to be something else. So there was that way of going about things. Um, and so, you know, and that involved various requirements on them. One of them is that whatever their problems are, they have to be immediately related to our problems and what we think the important problems are. Anything they think is anything they had to say which was cool was something that, you know, you and your contemporaries could immediately kind of apprehend as a cool thing to say without having to like be taught to think in a new way, which that philosophy, you know, which requires really entering into that philosopher's thought. It was just like, you know, a doctrine, you know, neutral monism or something. And it's between this and that doctrine we have, but this one, you know, this piece of the conceptual map isn't occupied yet. So that was kind of one paradigm. There's more we could say about it. And then the other was something where there was a kind of sense that like a reading of a text owes fidelity to the text. And you have to like ground your reading in quotations, and it needed to be sort of historically or philologically or hermeneutically or exegetically. These are, I think, slightly different schools and slightly different standards, but, you know, in some sort of way vindicated as a reading. And, you know, passages that didn't fit are a problem for you and so forth. But, you know, in most of those traditions, there's different ways of going about these things in those different subgroups of philosophies. I did sort of feel like those readings lost their like philosophical bite or their critical edge, you know. So now this is what they said, and you ask a question like, why is this an attractive view, or sort of, you know, what claim does this make in the present, or, you know, even why should we care, you know, it's sort of like, you know, or what, you know, what would have Leibniz said about that, you know. And so, well, we don't have a document which Leibniz, you know, discusses this, so you couldn't say what Leibniz thinks about this or what his view is, because, you know, I'd only be entitled to say that if I could, you know, actually quote him. And then another thing about these readings then, which became a kind of problem, is they work very much within the philosopher's terminology, you know. So you know, they were just, if they were writing about Kant, they were just replete, you know, with Kantian terms, or, you know, extreme case if they're writing about Heidegger. But this is even true, strangely, of someone like Wittgenstein. We wouldn't think this would be easy to happen. There'd just be, you know, like kind of all this jargon that keeps getting recycled. You know, you like want to know, okay, very good, but now what exactly is a form of life, or what is a language, or whatever. And there, this was amazingly unclarified, although there was all these debates about these things back and forth. So, you know, I kind of found myself wanting something out of each of these dispensations. I wanted, you know, a sense of that we can learn from interesting philosophers of the past, the present, if we tend to the words. And if they're the really great ones, they have new and strange ways, or initially will strike us as strange, different ways of thinking. That is real work to enter into, and it's worth your time. And so you kind of do need to be willing to go to school, you know, with them, and go to their texts and enter into it, and not just constantly be keeping score on, do I think this is true? Do I think this is false? Do I want to put a big, hairy, enthusiastic asterisk in the margin, or a frowny face? But, you know, just like figure out how the whole thing hangs together. And spending some time doing that in a way, you know, trusting it to pay off. And you have to make decisions about which authors you think are worthwhile and that you trust. But I think it's very different to read an author you don't completely understand and realize there's something that I trust here, which I think is going to be worth, you know, years of my life to figure out. And you can do that, I think, without being too impatient to like demand that you already understand every, you know, half of it right up front. That was worth doing, and that it had certain kinds of huge philosophical payoffs if you're willing to do that. And we could kind of bracket maybe as a topic for future discussion, because I think it fits into one of your later categories quite well, you know, what the philosophical payoffs of doing that could be. Do that, but also, like, if you want to reap those gains, those payoffs, do it, you know, not just with an eye to, you know, burning incense at the altar of that figure, or just, you know, kind of antiquarian interest in, you know, what did this guy think at that time, but never lose the urgent question, why does this matter? Even why does this matter to contemporary philosophy? I think that's always something I'm thinking about in a way a certain kind of historian of philosophy doesn't. I'm not I'm not saying that unscrupulous opportunism hasn't caused people to have good thoughts. I'm not saying really good work in the history of philosophy that does not share my interest in what the contemporary payoff could be in engaging this text isn't very important work to have, and which I myself have piggybacked on when I read these philosophers. But that there's a kind of work to do that's neither of those, that sort of keeps the concern for a certain kind of fidelity and mastery of the philosopher's thought from the inside, but also reads it with a critical eye. I've always loved this phrase in Kant, where Kant says the aim in reading a great philosopher is to try to understand the philosopher better than he understood himself. So this can connect up with the topic of resolute reading. So what you want to do is sort of master that philosophy in a way in which the measure of what it is to think it through isn't, I think the one that a lot of historians work with, which is, can we ascribe these sentences to that philosopher as a matter of historical fact? If we asked, philosopher, P, do you think so and so, they would have said yes to each of our questions. That means we're reading them well. And then, of course, for like certain questions, then like the one I mentioned about Leibniz, then there's no answer because they just couldn't have, they couldn't have thought about it because they didn't. Rather, you can have a sense of like what their thought demands and how it works, so that you can even say things like, here they are not remaining faithful to their own thought. And I think that is always the engine of the history of philosophy. If you try to understand anything about the relationship between Aristotle and Plato, or Spinoza and Descartes, or Hegel and Kant, or Wittgenstein and Russell, or pick your favorite, Heidegger and Husserl, your favorite pair of successive famous philosophers. The latter is always partly criticizing the former in the name of a conception of philosophy that the former had tried to realize, but in a way that sort of then winds up transforming it out of the conception of what faithfulness to the requirements of its own, fundamental conception of philosophy requires, or something like that. And so that, this is actually, I think, the engine of philosophical change. So it's a little bit bizarre that it's kind of missing, in these two ways of reading past texts, or even texts of contemporaries sometimes. So, so I want something that keeps the sense of, a certain need to apprentice, at the feet of the philosopher, learn one way around it, tolerate what's strange in their system, learn how it ticks from the inside, have one's claims about what belongs to philosophy made with a certain conception of what fidelity to that philosophy requires, which, as I said, is not the same thing as what that person, as a matter of psychological historical fact, would have required, would have said. And then at the same time, do so with an interest to what its philosophical potency is, what its philosophical fruitfulness, how it bears in the present, how that detour into that philosopher's thought, we come back out of it and return to the contemporary landscape, could become an engine of philosophical progress, so that one's reading kind of with one eye on the text or the past figure, and one eye on present debate, and that's something which maybe isn't always explicit in some of the texts I've written that are more exegetical, but I think I do have one eye kind of fixed in the other place, and I'm trying to give a reading that I think which if people that weren't specialists in Nietzsche or Kant or Wittgenstein, whatever the damn figure is, read it, would open up possibilities for thought in contemporary philosophy that would, could be fruitfully transformative. So the first thing to say about a resolute reading is, I think, my idea and the possibility of such readings came about through this kind of dissatisfaction, looking for something that's combined. The term resolute reading is actually not one I came up with. I'm happy to self-apply. I actually quite like the word. I just being honest here. It's not a term I came up with. It came up, initially in a very kind of local way in these debates about how to read the Tractatus. And especially kind of reading of the Wittgenstein's Tractatus that Cora Diamond and I developed, and then it got called a resolute reading because, you know, the idea is what is it to like really think through certain things Wittgenstein says in the Tractatus, which to a lot of people kind of, you know, so he's, you know, he says all kinds of strange things. He says, you know, philosophy does not consist in putting forward sentences. There are no philosophical sentences. It's not consist in a doctrine or body of content. It consists in a method. But, you know, his book seems to be full of philosophical sentences and people want to ascribe them. So how could that possibly be true? You know, he says other things like the sentences in this book that really elucidate, that is, that confer, you know, philosophical progress or insight, are nonsensical. And one understands the book by recognizing the sentences. And, you know, I could mention other sentences of his, but those are two things he says in the book. And the tendency was to treat those as, you know, kind of extreme, really. And then, you know, if we really lay out, you know, what, you know, the theory of language or whatever the Tractatus is, then given that is this theory, it can be put forward in these senses and we can make sense of, then they'd say something like, well, technically it qualifies as nonsense given, you know, his theory of sense, or they just say more blatantly, as, you know, some of the leading expositors of Wittgenstein, like Peter Hacker did, you know, it's just gross inconsistency between Wittgenstein's meta philosophy and his philosophy just doesn't, you know, what he actually does doesn't fit that at all. So you just bracket everything he tells you about what he's doing in philosophy and everything he thinks he's doing when he's trying to practice philosophy. You don't need any of that. You know, we just need our conception of what his philosophy and understand his philosophy. And so with respect to that book, we were sort of saying, no, you need to take these remarks seriously and then think through, you know, what it would be to read the whole book that provides a reading that could make it look like the case, once equipped with that reading, that he wasn't actually out of his mind to have been saying things. So what was he at least trying to do? Of course, that's consistent with his not having completely succeeded. Maybe even his conception is one that in certain ways isn't completely cashable, but it shouldn't be a conception which is just obviously uncashable, because then he's not the interesting philosopher he evidently is. So and so that became called a resolute reading because it's like resolutely thinking through what it would be to take those sentences in the book seriously. But then, you know, I came to think that's actually quite a nice label for what I was doing in my readings of lots of figures. If one gets it generic enough, I'm not, you know, sometimes, I have a chapter in one book where I offer something I call a resolute reading of Descartes in a recent book. And then I've been asked, so you think Descartes thinks all of the sentences are nonsense? Because that's what resolute readers think about Tractatus. No, that's like not the right level of specification of, you know, what I'm taking from the generic idea of a resolute reading. It's taking certain remarks of Descartes that seem most puzzling and commentators most want to set aside, but seem self-evidently absolutely crucial to him. And he's saying, you've understood nothing of my philosophy to understand this, and seeing what it would be to take those remarks seriously and read everything else in the light of them. And so think through his philosophy in light of, you know, what he himself is saying about how he understands it. That's what I understand to be the generic idea of a resolute reading. I do think this sort of non-accidentally winds up taking sentences that get kind of viewed as lapses or things that commentators kind of want to look askance upon or just look away from, because they seem to be nonsense to the commentator. So I do think the issue of nonsense weirdly does always in some sort of way come up when one's trying to give a resolute reading of a certain kind of philosopher and then defending that reading against a certain kind of mainstream of contemporary interpretation, especially within the province of contemporary Anglophone philosophy of the last, half or 3/4 of a century. But but then if that's right, that's more of a side effect than, something I think is at the heart of the idea of a resolute reading. So there's a lot more I could say about that, but that's just kind of a beginning of, of an answer. You're welcome to follow up on that.
I think there are connections we're getting at with the next question, so it would maybe be good if you even treat that as a follow-up for the the next kind of. Yeah, I really appreciate that. That was great. So just kind of on this topic of kind kind of learning to think with someone and see the kinds of, trends in their thought, and, maybe understanding its relevance through that, but having that patience to do that, I guess kind of ties into a certain character you find in your writing. So I guess reading out the question, one noteworthy kind of characteristic of your writing is that philosophical work with successes and failures is very much on display. So in the dialectic perspectivism, we see Nietzsche in this kind of dynamic way where he's grasping at this insight and working to think it all the way through. In Two Varieties of Skepticism, we see Putnam and McDowell trying and failing to understand one another. In Must We Show What We Cannot Say, we get an obituary for an article that you yourself had wanted to write. And this definitely kind of contrasts this kind of quasi-scientific style of philosophical writing where we get a result and only the cleanest arguments up to it. I mean, I guess there are exceptions, but could you maybe talk a bit kind of about why you choose to write philosophy in that way, and kind of what you're looking to convey in doing that you couldn't otherwise convey? Of course, this ties in very closely with the last, yeah.
It's a great question. I really appreciate it. It also forces me to think about things that I'm not always asked to think about, but I think are interesting. I don't get asked this kind of question that much, really. Again, I'm sort of inclined to start kind of in the counterpart of the place I started in your first question. So, I mean, I do think it's part of the contemporary dispensation of philosophy that it's like an unstated assumption of a lot of forms of institutionalization of philosophy that are kind of now dominant in the research university. And as philosophy's become more specialized, and standards for graduate admissions and graduate programs, or for hiring committees, or for tenure and criteria, these things have kind of gotten more and more, I don't know how to put it, ossified or something, that there's something like a kind of philosophical prose, which is just like good professional philosophical prose. And there's a kind of unit of philosophical expression, which is the journal article. And that, anything that's really worth saying that can be said well ought to be sayable in a journal article. And if it's not, then, even if you're faced with such a choice, you should write a journal article about something instead of that other thing, because that's somehow what we're supposed to be doing. And this does interact with one half of the beginning of my answer to the other question, because then it also leads to a way of like writing about other philosophers, be they Plato or Kant or Nietzsche or whoever, such that the ideas that you can extract from their only ideas of interest, if they're extractable, expressible in something that has the form of a journal article. So if there's something about the structure of the first critique, that cannot be replicated in a journal article, or Plato's dialogues, or Augustine's confessions, or Descartes' meditations, then you can talk about it, but philosophy can't happen in that way, because a journal article, is not equipped to let it happen. And I just mentioned some of those famous texts in philosophy. I can mention some of the others. And I also think in a way, it's like glaringly obvious that those things don't have the form of journal articles, and that they don't have the form of journal articles is not like a merely accidental fact about them. It's not like everybody was writing meditations in Descartes' day, or everybody was writing something called the Critique of X in Kant's day. I mean, most of these forms of philosophical authorship were themselves like, revolutionary and coincident with the form of philosophy that, they were trying to impart. So I think in great philosophy, it invariably happens that there is a certain kind of unity of form and content, that the philosopher, in thinking through what they want philosophy to be, in some sort of way, like imparts their conception of what philosophy is in the very way they do it. And the very way they do it brings us out. I think this is even much more true in the analytic tradition than the analytic tradition is awfully, willing to admit. But I find that if you give me a stretch of 5 sentences by any one of a number of philosophers I think are quite interesting, Wittgenstein, John Austin, Gilbert Ryle, John McDowell, Cora Diamond, Stanley Cavell, Saul Kripke, Elizabeth Anscombe, Barry Stroud, I could keep making this list longer. I can pick out who that philosopher is. I mean, admittedly, I've been around a while and I've read a lot, but I go, that's Barry Stroud. There's a certain kind of like no nonsense, no jargon, stake the point with a certain kind of clarity, a certain kind of centrality, which is connected to Barry Stroud's whole conception of philosophy, and so on for these, different people. There's very different philosophical personalities present in these different people I mentioned. The way it's true is very different. But even in analytic philosophy, I think a lot of the more interesting philosophers, part of learning to read them is learning to hear their voice and catch on the melody. And then I think that's, true, because they haven't been working under these artificial constraints of the journal article to a much higher degree of exponentiation when we're talking about Plato or Aristotle, Descartes or Kant or figures outside the analytic tradition, Kierkegaard or Nietzsche or Marx or Hegel or Husserl or Heidegger or whoever. So I think part of learning to read these figures is learning to understand why they write the way they do, and a lot of misunderstanding them is sort of pulling remarks out of their texts without understanding what their structural or dialectical role is. I mean, I think a lot of misreadings of Kant turn on taking earlier remarks of his and saying, here's Kant's definition of an intuition, but Kant makes it clear there are no definitions in philosophy. And then later on, he says something else about intuitions, and then the analytic philosopher says, well, Kant contradicts himself, and he has two concepts of intuition, intuition sub one, intuition sub two, and they'll start introducing distinctions, because this is what you would do if you're writing a bit of analytic philosophy. But if Kant's trying to show us the conditions of the possibility of certain things, then initially we don't fully have these into view, and we get them more completely into view, and then we see how our initial glosses and that involves just a different method. I'm just picking one out which is in a way central to the history of philosophy, but also does not fit a certain picture of like what writing's supposed to be. And of course, that's even more true of some of the other figures I write about. So the thing, here, I think I early on kind of rebelled against was the idea that all of my prose was sort of supposed to fit some ideal of philosophical writing, which itself could be specified and mastered as a kind of template of a form of writing, regardless of what I was thinking about. So I think I had a desire to kind of let how I write about things be connected to what I was writing about. The way I would put it is to experiment with style. So now I think I'm coming to a pivot in my answer to your question, where I think I want to reject something you almost said in the way you asked the question. I mean, you said, what, led you to, that way of writing, the way you write, and I think, if I'm really doing what I want to, and it's not easy to do what you want to, maybe I'm not completely succeeding, and that's what your question shows, but I think if I'm really doing what I want to, then it should be hard to say what is the way I write, I think sometimes I'm writing for a more popular audience. Sometimes I'm writing for a more narrow audience. You mentioned one article where I start by writing about the obituary of the article I could have written. I think it's true of many of the things I wrote. I'm always arguing with a way of thinking that I once found attractive. I mean, I kind of always want to avoid criticizing something I don't myself think is interesting or know why anyone would think. I mean, I'm not saying there's no place for polemics in philosophy, but I've almost never been interested in them. And when people write articles about me in which they criticize me, which I think aren't really very good, and other people say, well, you need to reply to that. And I found I don't want to. I don't want to spend time, just crushing things I think are not good. I mean, I think a lot of analytic philosophy actually almost trains people, encourages them to try to find stuff they think are really bad arguments and destroy them. I'm not saying there's no place for that. I think, polemics are incredibly important in politics, but I think when they take center stage in philosophy, it turns philosophy into politics in a way that's not good for philosophy. So I don't think I'm ever criticizing a reading which I feel contempt for. I've always can bring it alive in myself, and often maybe it once was alive in some former self of mine, and sometimes I'm fighting with that self as I'm writing it. That's part of the point of the article. But that doesn't mean everything I write, has the form of an obituary, of an article I didn't write. So, I mean, I've tried to find a lot of different ways of doing this. I mean, I have one philosophy article that has like the structure of an exam people take first and then comment on them. I've had, one that had kind of the structure of a pseudonymous text a bit. I've done lots of different things in different kinds of ways. And I think I'm always sort of, interested in thinking about different ways of not just kind of repeating, a template for a way of writing an article, another article I wrote. So, and also thereby, trying to look, for a form that I think will help, kind of bring out a kind of issue in a way that it wouldn't be if it was just, a set of, conclusions for which I wanted to argue, and then a set of arguments for those conclusions. And therefore, I think often, like with a certain conception of who the best readers are, for this article, who are the people at least proximate will be the ones that will profit from most, with like those groups, not being the same groups each time I write. They're overlapping. I think some of those articles I wrote on Nietzsche, now analytic philosophy is going to be very interested and they won't read. And, and conversely, for maybe, certain things I've written on, philosophy of perception, criticizing McDowell, most Nietzsche readers are just not going to go there. And then there might be a little group in between and so forth. And that's okay with me. I think that itself, I'm hoping will keep me philosophically young, that I'm not getting stuck in those ways, and I have to modulate my voice in those ways. So that there's something I'm reacting to, and that bears its stamp in the way I'm writing. That seems to me absolutely right. That there is just this way I write. I'm not sure that's true. I mean, I think some articles I let myself put things in like very nuanced, or some, not articles, but some texts. I let myself put things in ways that are very nuanced and carefully formulated. I know this is going to make it hard for certain people to read, but I just want to try to get this absolutely as clear as I can for myself, and it'll be good for other readers. Other things I write, about, I don't know, like the concept of America or something like this. I think most of my readers aren't going to be professional philosophers anyways. And so if I'm going to have any audience interested in that topic, I need to write about that topic in a way that can draw on the general non-philosophical reader. And that requires, that my sentences not get complicated in certain ways, or, that a certain kind of complication of syntax or qualification of concept, which belongs to certain ways of doing philosophy, is something that I'm not just in thrall of and I can't shed for the purposes of that writing. And so I have tried to, just like I think about teaching is a very different thing if I'm teaching freshmen or advanced undergraduates or graduate students, or if I'm going to give a lecture in another country where people aren't familiar with the assumptions that come with the Anglo-American dispensation that I'm coming from. I try also in my writing to sort of modulate my sense of the audience, which I think then shapes the form of what I'm doing, and vice versa.
Yeah, I certainly didn't intend to imply that there's only, there's a really exciting variety.
Yeah.
So I appreciate that.
I mean, one way this is a little weird, it comes out, is I have certain things that are only in German or only Italian or only in French. And it's because I really had those audiences in mind, and the way in which I feel like they misunderstand certain things about, continental philosophy, or something I appreciate, about the way in which, Nietzsche exists, a figure which just doesn't in the English speaking tradition. And I want to sort of speak to that. And so, I could get those things in English. It seems weird to ask someone to translate them. So I guess I should provide an English version of those texts. But I haven't been that eager to do it, given all the other things I want to do, because I sort of feel like the audience I was writing for was in fact that audience. And so there's even kind of a linguistic dimension to it as well.
So I do have a follow-up, because I think in how I originally wrote the question, I maybe ran two things together, and you did a good job pulling them apart. So one thing I guess I want to ask you is, across the different, experiments with writing style, is there kind of a core thing you want to hang on to most, right? Maybe some kind of dynamic presentation of the thought. Like, what is there something that you just couldn't do without in how you want to present?
That's a great question. I don't see anything wrong with the question, which isn't the same thing as my just feeling like I know what the answer is. I feel like saying probably, but I mean, if I'm going to give you an honest answer, I think I'd really have to like step back and think about that. I mean, I do think a lot. I don't know, I just don't have like all the things I've written even before my mind's eye, to know whether, if I say something, it'll be true of all of them. I mean, I don't see that I have like special first person authority on this. You've read a bunch of texts of mine that you mentioned a lot more recently than I've looked at them. You might be in a better position to do this than I am for some of these things. But I think it's true of a lot of things I've written that, I'm addressing a certain way one's inclined to read a philosopher, or a certain way when one first picks them up, or a certain way one's inclined to think about an issue when one first thinks about it. Or, maybe, I don't know, maybe not first, but, seriously, but for a while. And then I want to criticize that way. But in the writing, I think I do kind of want to make vivid what that way of thinking is, and kind of move from it, and kind of, if I'm criticizing it, kind of get it to collapse under its own way. So I'm not doing the thing that I was thinking is characteristic of a philosophical polemic, where I'm just holding that way of thinking a certain distance and kind of making it clear from sentence one that, I'm sneering at it, and it is to be looked down upon, and not really, it is to be disrespected even before we've started to criticize it. So I do think there's, something about, there is something methodologically fundamental, I think, to a lot of what I've written. I don't know about all of it, which is that, one needs to understand the frame of mind of the philosophical cast of thought, from the inside that one's criticizing, and know what it sounds like and feels like to inhabit that point of view, want to say those things, and then trying to be sort of, and also I think another reason is I think almost any such cast of mind is onto some truth. I mean, that's all the other problems. I don't think views in philosophy that have lasting and staying power are like just wrong, even if, maybe some of the hegemony they've exercised has been quite truly intellectually catastrophic. There's something that makes them attractive. So it's also sort of trying to separate, the element of truth in that philosophical point of view from the philosophical overkill, which has come with it. And if one's holding something at a distance and just kind of looking down on it, then you're not going to be able to do that, because you're trying to draw a big line, or, take an eraser to the whole thing. So I'm not putting this very clearly, but I think there's some, sense of like what it is to like, bring alive and also enter the point of view of that which I'm criticizing. And then, so that's the first thing. And then a lot of things I've written, but now this is not everything. It's a smaller number of things. Often there's, to borrow a phrase from that one Nietzsche essay, a kind of dialectic where actually there's kind of warring points of view. And I'm trying to do that for both of them. They each have some truth to them, but there's certain overkill in them. Something right, some impulse in forms of philosophical realism that one doesn't want to just throw out. And there's some kind of backlash against them that isn't, based on nothing. One's trying to like kind of hang on to the philosophical wisdom in each of those without the recoil in either direction. And then often I think, further, and this is like now even going to be a smaller set of texts that I'm writing about, but still a fair number when they're kind of a little bit more exegetical in character. I often think part of what I'm doing in doing something like that is enacting something that's going on in the writing of the very philosopher I'm writing about. So I have a kind of excessive statement of it's almost like a joke, but I sometimes wonder if it could just be true. I have this statement at the beginning of an essay of mine called "Why Kant is Not a Kantian," where I say something like, the last names, the philosophical positions that we know that have been formed by taking the last name of a philosopher and having it be the name of an ism, Platonism, Cartesianism, Kantianism, Wittgensteinianism, choose your favorite example, almost always turn out to be views that that very philosopher was trying to criticize. Actually, you could write an article why Descartes is not a Cartesian, why Plato is not a Platonist, why Wittgenstein is not, a Wittgensteinian. It often will be a little clearer, if you say something like why Descartes is not a Cartesian dualist, or why Wittgenstein is not a Wittgensteinian, communal agreement, a theorist, or something. But it's something that's tending to be essential to his view that I think actually is in his text. It's not like it has nothing to do with his view, it's just like weirdly been projected in there. It's in his text, but it's something that's being worked through and criticized. And people have kind of like seen what the initial thematics are, but we're in such a hurry to extract an ism that they haven't like sort of really understood what you call the movement of the thought in the philosophy. So there is no movement, and the initial structure they get is just kind of frozen, and they turn it into a doctrine. So in some of my writing, in doing something like this, I'm also trying to sometimes like reenact something I think that's going on in the philosophy I'm talking about in a different way. So somehow in my text, its enactment is a little more, I don't know, tightly controlled and abstracted from other details and without all of the jargon, and it's happening in somewhat more confined space. But if you can see the thing that I'm enacting, and you can see how it mirrors something that's being enacted in a different scale and level of complexity than in, whoever it is, Kant or Wittgenstein or some other philosopher, it's really provided some helpful orientation for, understanding, what the movement of thought. I like that phrase a lot. I might say it's one of Hegel's favorite expressions, but I don't use it that much, but I think it's kind of nice here, is in that philosophy, what animates it, how it works. Because I think that's often the thing that's lost when we're sort of in a hurry in our kind of age where we want the encyclopedia article capsule version of a philosopher's thought, is that it kills the philosophy because it kills the movement of the thought. You just want to be able to sort of state the result of the thought. And I think most of these philosophers, even if you can do that, you don't even understand the sentences that express the result. If you understand the method by which they entitled themselves or came to clarify things in such a way that those words could stand for what you would come to see if you went through that journey. And people kind of want to know what the destination of the journey is and what you'll see without taking the journey. And I think all you have is some words that will be misunderstood. So I think, that's one thing I'd say I'm trying to do in a lot of my writing, in one way or another. I'm trying to put it vague enough that the different ways in which I do it, could all count as cases of it. I still think we can probably find a few things I've written that, that maybe aren't doing this, but that's one thing. But I'm sure there are other things to say, about some things I care about my writing that's going on in most of it. But I'd have to step back and think about it. It's one thing, it's easy for me to tell you the things I care about in philosophy. It's a lot harder for me to say, I am succeeding in actualizing my care for this aspect of philosophy in each and everything I write. I mean that would be great. That's hard to do. And I don't know, about which of those things I care about, how much I've succeeded in really spreading it out over everything I do. So it's a hard question to answer. I'd be, maybe some point, we can have a different Zoom, and I'd be interested to hear, since you guys read a bunch of things, like what your answers to the question to like that about me would be. I might learn something about myself.
Really,
I don't know if you if you were expecting an answer you didn't get, which, I mean, if so, I'd be.
I'm not sure. I think
I thought it was very interesting.
no, I think that was very interesting. I think the thought that went behind that question in some sense was that we were very struck, and I think very impressed by, in some sense, the way in which your and I'll try to avoid a general characterization here, but the way in which many of your articles seem to differ in so many ways from the type of journal articles that one becomes used to growing up in the analytic tradition in the Anglo-American world. And I suppose there was just like some, I guess, kind of amazement that in some sense that philosophy can be done this way. And it seems as if one gets a lot more interesting thoughts out of it. And I suppose we sort of just wanted to hear you talk about it. And I think you gave a very excellent sort of explanation in some sense of
yeah. If we're sort of saying, here's something I'm trying not to do, or not trying not to just do, or not always to do, yeah, then you know, in that negative way, I think we can find, you know, something characterize a lot of things. I mean, some of the things I've written have been published in journals, you know, and I've even, you know, been solicited by journals. And I mean, I will say something like, I mean, it's, you know, maybe it's worth pointing out that there's, you know, there's a certain equilibrium on this, and we've kind of been emphasizing the kind of like what I don't want to do. But another thing I don't want to do is sort of put myself out of cognitive contact with my philosophical community. I mean, I think a lot of people are like unhappy with their philosophical present or philosophical age. You know, it is a kind of a recipe to sort of turn into a cranky eccentric, you know, and then to feel like your work is great and you're doing this really weird particular stuff. And but you know, everybody else reads it and just, you know, either thinks what's a crank or what a crank, or maybe you have a few disciples who really love you, but then they just like hate everything about, you know, what everybody else is calling philosophy. And I mean, so I mean, one person I admired when I was young, and it was a teacher of mine part of the time, was Stanley Cavell. And I mean, I definitely, there were things I really admired about him, but I did think, you know, always about myself, that I did not want my equilibrium point to kind of be placed where he placed his, where I thought, you know, he was just a little bit too willing to like insist upon his own idiosyncrasy and his own, you know, for to do something interesting, that he sort of not be accountable to, you know, the philosophical mainstream sense of what matters. Whereas, you know, I'm trying to like make the case for being able to write philosophy, think about philosophy, read this philosopher in such a way that it makes a claim on people who think it won't make a claim, you know. So that means, you know, I can't just write in a way that's just for like a coterie where, you know, people, I don't want to be writing in such a way that the people who learn, you know, Conant speak and then in Conant's jargon can read Conant. That's something I have tried to avoid, which, you know, I think can go with a certain kind of dissatisfaction with the mainstream often. So, I mean, there's something in analytic philosophies, there's something in the analytic tradition's aspiration to clarity and wanting a certain, I mean, I don't think this is as true of analytic philosophy, but in its heyday, wanting a certain kind of canon that's shared within the tradition, that has certain kinds of, you know, make certain claim of intelligibility and accessibility, you know, that I value. You know, I don't think it's new to analytic tradition. I think, you know, it's all over the place in like the historical Socrates. But I think there's certain dispensations of philosophy in which, perversely, it's professionalization or specialization or, you know, becoming incredibly fashionable in certain Parisian intellectual circles or whatever, like defeats. And, you know, in a weird way, I think analytic philosophy has defeated some of its own virtues in its professionalization. But there was a certain kind of Socratic aspect to analytic philosophy. We'd have to think about what Socratic means there, and its kind of reaction to like the institutionalized philosophy of the 19th century, which is something I like. And so I'm looking for an equilibrium point between what you were saying, where one is chafing and looking for ways of writing and thinking that allow for possibilities of thought that are getting lost by a certain kind of dominant conception of what the issues are, what the problems are, what the mode of writing should be to treat them. I think those things all come together in a certain kind of, you know, to borrow a phrase from Kuhn, paradigm of what normal philosophy should look like. And I think I've always thought, you know, once philosophy starts normalizing itself in that way, it's dying. You know, and the real philosophy is always, you know, in a certain way, chafing against the idea of its normality. But also, you know, presenting itself in such a way that can make acclaim and people who are interested in philosophy that is intelligible, accessible. So I mean, I think there's a kind of a tricky kind of halfway point. And I think one of the things I was saying in my previous answer, in that I think different things I write for different audience in different ways is I'm like setting that like equilibrium point in a very different place in different things I write, because it's hard to know where it should be in general and what kind of compromise it is. So sometimes it's like closer to like the profession, and sometimes it's further out. Sometimes it's sort of more towards people that have been trained in Germany than America, or vice versa, because there's just a lot of places to position that point between wanting to do something different and wanting to speak to an audience that this reaches, so that they come to think, yeah, it would be good to think about things differently. I'm not just preaching to the converted. So that is itself, I think, a kind of difficulty about wanting to do something different, is that there's just the danger of philosophy become over professionalized, normalized, institutionalized, but there's also like the danger of it's just becoming arrogant, cranky, and cliquish, and it's like hard to find that middle. There's no one place that middle point is. I think you have to just keep looking for it in all kinds of different ways.
So,
yeah, thank you for that. Thank you.
So this does lead really naturally into kind of discussion of philosophical traditions. The first part of this I wrote, and I realized in our discussion I want to modify a bit. So I was going to hand this over to Braeden, but you want to do the second half?
Absolutely.
Okay. Sorry. So in this kind of emphasis on, as we were talking about your writing, enactment, kind of bringing to life the motion of thought, right? There's a certain kind of resistance to treating philosophy as static, right? So there's this kind of dynamic element, and that has certain resonances with certain themes throughout American philosophy. You've at times aligned yourself with the pragmatist tradition and written really great pieces on some of its leading figures, James Rorty. So we're interested in kind of how you see yourself with respect to, for example, the American philosophical tradition. We've talked some about the analytic tradition, and we can kind of continue to talk about those in connection with one another. But I guess this is just maybe a broader question of how do you situate yourself kind of historically? How do you conceive of yourself with respect to traditions?
Yeah, you guys are asking really good questions, and questions that I'm not usually asked. So I appreciate that, because I get to think a new thought if I can answer. Yeah, I mean, this question is rich enough. I think I don't know how to answer it without kind of teasing apart layers in it. So there's first like a general question about traditions. And then there's a question about situating myself with respect to traditions. And then there's a question about American philosophy as a tradition. And then there's a question about situating myself, in relation to American philosophy. Yeah, those are like 4 layers I hear in that question. And I don't have a thing to say that I think, is like an answer in all 4 of those registers at once. So maybe I'll just take it in 4 bites. So I mean, first, why do I care about philosophical traditions? It wasn't something I was taught to care about in my initial training. I mean, I was being trained as an analytic philosopher, but there's a weird way in which analytic philosophers can train analytic philosophers to be analytic philosophers. Well, kind of the concept of tradition playing no role. It's just like, this is what it is to be serious and clear and rigorous. And it's as if there, was a tradition-free way of doing philosophy, whereas of course, the entire conception of what, rigor is and so forth, I think, is mediated and shaped by the tradition in which one belongs, which I say is no criticism at all. I don't think that's a bad thing. It's not, I don't think I have any idea what it would be to realize the fantasy of a tradition-free way of philosophy, or most other things for that matter. Traditions are the enabling conditions of philosophy, I think. And analytic philosophy is in many ways a wonderful tradition, but it's kind of, in certain ways, kind of, I think, in its heyday, ideologically in denial about the conditions, its own possibility, including its own virtues, I think. just, getting the concept of for tradition to view as an important one was probably more of a struggle for me than it would have been, if I started out, as a Chinese philosopher working on Chinese philosophy, or, something like that, where it's like, if you're doing that, in the United States, you can't like help but be thinking about tradition probably, the moment you enter a classroom, because, you're somehow interested in one which isn't everybody's or something. So, but part of what made me very interested in thinking about philosophical traditions initially, this is just an honest autobiographical answer. It's not, answer the question why do I, is this all of the reasons I think one should be? But I think part of is I thought both thinking about history of philosophy and thinking about other philosophical traditions, when I was like very young, when I was being brought up initially as an analytic philosopher, like the first word for this was continental philosophy, and I didn't even know what that was, but I just knew it was some kind of other analytic philosophy, and so maybe I should like figure out what that is. I mean, I think I now think it's not a very well framed concept, and there's like a number of traditions there that are not analytic but are not one thing. I think German idealism and French German phenomenology are both really interesting traditions that are related to each other, but I would distinguish them and so forth. But I think my initial reason for being interested in this is just they provided me with ways of overcoming philosophical provincialism. I mean, I guess I've always thought that there's something like weirdly contradictory about wanting to be a philosopher but doing it provincially. I mean, there's a certain kind of Kant distinguishes two concepts of philosophy, what he calls the scholastic concept of philosophy, the Schulbegriff, and the cosmopolitan concept, or the Latin is kind of nice here. It's like the conceptus cosmicus, the cosmic concept of philosophy. and Kant says, I think something right about this. You need both. And one way of like applying his thought is, to our slightly, is putting a little more of an edge of a certain sort on is you need to belong to a tradition, I think, to do philosophy well and be able to talk to people in tradition. But you also need to have some conception of like what philosophy is beyond that tradition, the way in which philosophy, addresses and is concerned with questions that, that will concern you, before you know what that tradition will, and concern other philosophers outside that tradition, and, will continue to be of concern as that tradition, is transformed or even, comes to an end. So there's something weird if philosophy just is provincial and has no cosmopolitan aspiration. And it just seemed like one way to, overcome provincialism in one's conception of philosophy and overcome, as it were, what's parochial in one's own dispensation of philosophy, because wherever you study it, however you study it, it will be in some dispensation. You'll be talking to certain people, you have certain professors. It's to reach into the history of philosophy and where it was just different and try to bring that alive for yourself. But another way to do it is, by looking at kind of philosophical others, who seem strange and other, but are still doing philosophy, and try to enter and see what they're doing, because that's another way you can sort of see your own tradition from your outside. And just like I think self-knowledge requires to some extent being able to see yourself as others see you, I think, knowledge of what you think in philosophy requires some ability to see, what the ways you think in philosophy look from the outside. And people don't just share those ways. And I think, philosophical traditions are like a resource for that. And then, they're a positive resource because sometimes, one of the things they do is they allow you to like see assumptions that don't even look like assumptions, or see things that are like the method you're practicing that you never completely articulated as a method, but this is how you do things. And that doesn't mean it's wrong, but it might at least force you to like self-consciously now defend and vindicate that method or those assumptions in a way you didn't before because they were invisible. And probably in doing that, you will change them a little bit, because you'll sort of realize what's essential to them and what's just like intellectual fashion. And sometimes they'll make you question them. And that will be, I think, a real spur to change your progress. And, we'll just you have to see how that goes. it's not baked in from the start, then another philosophical tradition will dissatisfy you with yours. But I think it will change your relation to your own. Just like learning another language will make you all notice all sorts of things you didn't notice. Like, wow, I walk to school, it's not what I am doing now. It's like habitual. It means I always walk. So we call it the present tense, but actually, it's this much more complicated verb form, which is different from I'm walking to school. I mean, I think, it's not a thing I really noticed about English till I learned another language and realized, that, I had to say the thing that we say by saying I walk to school every day, using something that isn't the present tense in their language. And they have nothing like I am walking to school, and they screw that up when they speak English. Even very good English speakers will say things like I am, they'll order their food and they will say I am having a hamburger, and the waiter will look really confused and go, well, not yet, you're not, whatever. So I think, just getting another philosophical tradition into view just brings your own into view for you in a way it can't be into view for you if you have no sense of, some fluency in, the analog in my metaphor to like a second language, and so that was like what initially attracted me to it, and what I thought. I mean, I don't think, I've ever thought that I'm just something else, that I belong to another tradition. I was converting. I mean, I think to the extent that I am anything, I'm an American analytic philosopher who is, trying to have as open a mind and as deep a capacity for self-criticism as I am able to cultivate in myself in a finite number of years. But I think that's an instrument to doing that, so I have, at least for some traditions, tried to make myself, as fluent in them as I can. And the way in which one's fluent in a second language is not one's native language. That way, when learned as an adult, so one isn't maybe accent free in the way in which one speaks that language, but one can speak to people in that tradition and have conversation with them. The metaphor is working pretty well, really.
It follows.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking I was going to get in trouble, but it's just so far it hasn't broken down really. So that's, something about traditions, and something about, how I see myself in relation to those other traditions. Now, American philosophy. I mean, one question is just like what those words even mean. I mean, we have a concept of nationality, and we have a concept of philosophy, and like now we're conjoining them into some kind of like pair of concepts that serve to function as a sortal. I mean, but if it, so one way to understand, American philosophy is, kind of the way I understand, four-wheel drive American trucks. There are four-wheel drive trucks that are American, and there are four-wheel drive trucks that are not American. What it is to be a four-wheel drive truck has nothing to do as such with its being American, and vice versa. So one thing American philosophy just means is you're a philosopher and you're also an American. Even that's a little unclear. Does it mean you have a US passport, or does that mean you teach in American university and mostly talk to American philosophers? And come to think of it, you could do that even not, teaching American university. In which case there are American philosophers, who are phenomenologists and, analytic philosophers and so many other things. And there is a certain kind of dominant tradition of Anglophone philosophy, and have to say what that is. And I think, often when someone in Germany talks about American philosophy, what they're thinking of is like largely post-war analytic philosophy with a bunch of other stuff in it. And it doesn't exclude pragmatism, for instance, but it also isn't particularly defined by it. You know what I mean? They're thinking about Putnam and Kripke and Nagel and all kinds of people, and some of those people might be more pragmatists or not, but it's just like all really different from Polish philosophy in specifiable ways, whatever, depending upon where they're looking out from. So, I think it's just or one can want the word American to mean something, more but then we'd have to like talk about what the something more is. I mean, and then I think part of this gets complicated because I think the American is already more complicated. I mean, the concept Polish, or German picks out a lot of things that, you know, Germany as a nation, doesn't really exist in anything like, a very large space until like late in the 19th century. It's much younger than America. And then in its present borders, not since 1989, and some other borders have just like incredibly young thing. But in some other way, German philosophy is much older than America. But but it wasn't because there was this like nation, this constitution of the shared like political or intellectual project. It's there's some conception of race or culture, ethnicity or language, and the beginning of his things like Luther translating the Bible into German, and Wolff like writing philosophy in German, and then Kant, really revolutionizing philosophy written in German. So German philosophy seems like a very distinctive thing, which is the back of German. And so that's like older than America by a whole lot, but it involves like a completely different like Sortal German, than American. It works differently. And you could say something very similar for Polish and so forth. So it marks out a certain kind of unity, but the unity has nothing to do with a state or a nation or a constitution or a political project. And language is like really central, to it. Whereas, America already kind of has a different logic, and then, I think that's a philosophical topic. I've tried to write about it a bit, but it's complicated. But, it's much easier to, if what we mean by America, by the way, that's a kind of tricky word too, but if what we mean by that is something like the United States of America in the first instance, then, we can like talk about its birth in a different kind of way. It's like dateable. But it's also aspirational, so it makes sense to think of America betraying its promise, whereas it's not clear what it is for the concept of the German to like fail to live up to being German. It's just like a much less clear thought, I think, if there's a thought there at all. I suppose Hitler had some version of such a thought, but it turns into something ugly, I think. So I think America involves a certain kind of, is itself a philosophical project in a certain kind of way. That's like the weird thing about it. So American philosophy has got some kind of philosophical content on the American side before it's like modifying the word philosophy, in the way German philosophy or Polish philosophy or whatever doesn't. And that already like complicates the concept a lot, I think. And then also that means, and one of the things the concept of America was trying to be, and I think especially when American philosophy is trying to be American, is, the new world's trying not to be the old world in like the 18th century language. Or America is not just trying to be Europe again, So American philosophy then, on this like more demanding conception of what it is, achieving its qualification account as American philosophy by declaring its difference from existing compensation of philosophy, and showing forth its Americanness. And then that's like a more complicated idea of American philosophy. I don't know if you had something like that in mind, but I think it's interesting. I think something like that does animate the pragmatists. It does animate other people who aren't much studied in philosophy departments, who preceded them and who they were, I think, not accidentally following, like Emerson and Thoreau and figures like that. It also, finds resonance in various contemporary philosophers in different ways. Someone who's not talked about much in this context, but I think is kind of interesting, is Rawls. I think Rawls had a certain idea of what he's doing in political philosophy, which was also very shaped by a certain concept of the American, so certain aspirationalism aspiration to a kind of American philosophy, which does not advertise itself as such, I think is in some post-Rawlsian philosophy, but then it's a little bit more narrowly political. I think somebody like Rorty obviously resonated to this theme. Cavell's another person in a very different way who resonated to this theme. We could make this list longer, who are just picking up something, in, the pragmatists or these other figures and thinking, there's something in the, it's philosophically interesting in the idea of America. Putnam, I think, is another person like this, which should matter to philosophy. But now what makes philosophy American is this like aspiration, but so it's not provincial in a way, it wants to bring everyone into the project of American philosophy. It's not like, whereas, Polish philosophy in a way marks the difference between Polish and non-Polish philosophy. So that's just itself a really complicated topic, a philosophical topic, I think. But you will notice, as I was thematizing, that topic, it bears some of the earmarks of some of the other things, we were saying. I do think, the concept of American, this is part of why I think there's something, philosophical at the heart of America, is trying to define itself through its difference, through certain existing dispensations. And it's not just trying to be un-European. I mean, I think there's some sense, in, the founding of America, that what's best and highest in Europe, will come fully to fruition here. And you also really see this, in the people that are looking across the pond. I mean, a Schiller or a Goethe or a de Tocqueville or all kinds of people in different points. I mean, I'm picking, close contemporaries to like the founding, but you can take this all the way up, to the present. They're going, yes, I mean, so Schiller will say things like, the German idealism project of, finds its fullest, contemporary expression in America, the ideals of America. This often, involves philosophical reflection and, in this period on the difference between the French Revolution and the American Revolution, and why the American Revolution, in the eyes of some is, not leading to a bloodbath, and why that's not an accident. And you find this in very different people. I think whatever, Nietzsche thinks is great about America, and thinks, the greatest philosophy will probably come next to America, is like very different than whatever Schiller has in mind. So, I mean, they're like very different ways to think that thought as a European. But the fact that they're thinking it, means, so not just people in America, people outside America are resonating this aspiration that, if Europe wants to remain most true to what like animated Europe when it's sort of in decline in a certain way, this requires a rejuvenation of those aspirations that will then, require something that's very different, and not in, and so then, the community won't be defined by our being the same race or our being the same religion or all speaking the same language or something else. And it involves all kinds of like weird possibilities, that a lot of which get played out in American literature and film. But, you can have a movie, about some Chinese immigrant who's, about to be, brutalized by a bunch of Texans in a bar, and they'll be saying something, like, you don't belong in America. And that person can quote something and say, and you can sort of feel like he has a better understanding of what America is than the people who just beat him up. No, he just got there. But the reason he has that understanding is because that's why he came there, because he thought this was the place where, you don't get beaten up because, you're Asian, you don't already speak English or whatever. And that, and so whatever, so you get these, so that somehow it's like the Americans that are working with the non-American conception of like what makes you an American, and the guy fresh off the boat who's come to America and cares about, wants to be part of the American project that, strangely is explaining to the guy with the American passport what he doesn't understand about America, and doesn't think this is just like a contradiction in terms. So yeah, there's definitely something in me that resonates to that. I've kind of been interested in that concept. I mean, I suppose it matters here that I didn't grow up in the United States, and I also grew up knowing I was American. So I did just spend, like, in a way most Americans don't, the first 16 years of my life wondering what the hell is it exactly that I am if I'm American, because I sort of felt like I was, so I think it's just been a question for me even before I went into philosophy, if I'm honest about this. But I also do think it's a kind of philosophical question, and it has saying it's a philosophical question and saying what's really philosophical about it means that it has a kind of shape that I think is not completely disconnected from some of the shape of the concerns I was talking about when I was talking about like what it is also to think about philosophy as a living tradition and to be criticizing, one's tradition, and why that also needs, it also requires a certain kind of comparative perspective. I don't think you can get to view what's like weird about the concept of America unless one compares it to the concept of the German or the Polish or something. And another thing to say about that's one thing you can compare it to. Another thing is I think there are other concepts that are weird, but not weird in the way America is, that, I don't know, belong to something like the same family. So, I mean, there's Israeli, there's Icelandic, there's Australian, there's modern Greek. I think all of those are actually, I'm choosing my examples carefully. They're all kind of weird. I mean, none of those are defined by people all speak a modern language, or just people who are part of a certain race, or but they also aren't like the concept of America. They're like, they have some difference in how they work. I mean, Israel's really bizarre. I mean, the common language is a language that was dead for a really long time, and everybody started speaking it like a few decades ago. And so, yeah, like commonality of language is like one of the things that holds the country together, but in a very different way than Germany or Poland. And how it works is like really complicated, in ways that don't translate into the complication of America, but equal it in their like philosophical complexity. I remember like hearing one conversation on a bus in Israel that was in Hebrew, but between a certain kind of Israeli and another kind of Israeli, and the second Israeli was talking to her child in Yiddish, and that was the language they spoke to. They spoke at home clearly, and so forth. She's concerned this child takes that language into adulthood, and the other Israeli young child was saying, "Why do you keep speaking to your child in Yiddish? You live in Israel now. Hebrew is the language of our country," and also it really confused her to have to learn two languages. Why are you talking to her in Yiddish? And then the other one said, "Because I don't want her to forget that she's a Jew," which is like this very aggressive way of, answering the first guy. And so there's like a possibilities for a certain kind of pluralism in the very conception of like, what it is, which mirrors something in America, I think, and even though in another way, its history is like much longer than Germany. So it's not like looking at the future and rather than the past, it's like way more complicated. The Greek's case has some of that complication in it. So, I mean, I think there are lots of, it's not like everything works, on the standard European model. But I think you need that model. And then there are various complicated cases, and America is one of them. And I do think the task of like just unraveling the logic of these conceptions of identity, is philosophical, and they wind up having, there's something aspirational about the state of Israel, and we have to spell it out. And there's different conceptions of that, and some of them seem more attractive to me than others, to be perfectly honest. But there is something philosophically aspirational in the very project. It's not just like, this is what we are as a merely historical given. It is, every bit as much America, if not more in some ways. Something that only happens if you can make the desert bloom in a certain kind of way, and that's a lot of extra energy invested in a certain project. It's not like it's not just I was born this, and because my parents were born this, and my parents were born that, and so forth. So I do think there are other concepts like that work the way America do, that there's a kind of philosophical aspect to the very concept of that kind of identity, so that the concept of national identity itself, I think, is like a very philosophically useless and a really thin concept, actually, I think. And then I do think the American one, matters more to me than any other, because that's the one I most am. But some of the others matter to me because I'm also those, or at least I'm a Jew. I'm not an Israeli, actually. Or because they're like very helpful for thinking about, as point of contrast. So I think the topic of American philosophy, it's a fine question, but I just feel like I don't want to say anything simple about it. I just think like it's a topic unto itself to be thought about. And what I know is that I want to think about it. You know what I mean? But I mean, I think,
Yeah.
to say this is what American philosophy is, however you pick it out, is already both a politically and philosophically contentious claim. Its boundaries are not obviously some object of consensus in the way in which like German philosophy is, unless it's the really boring concept of American philosophy I mentioned before, that which is these are Americans in the elder philosophy, but then it doesn't even pick out anything. It's a tradition, I think. But I do think there's a tradition of American philosophy where this question about what is American philosophy and what should it be and what's like the unity of the concept that's formed by having, a weighty conception of America and a weighty conception of philosophy, but to go stand for something. I think there is a tradition of thinking about that. And that's kind of what I call the tradition of American philosophy. But then within that tradition, the very concept of American philosophy, I think, is essentially contested in a fairly profound way.
Yeah, I was very interested to hear your thoughts on that because I'm a big fan of your paper on America and the analytic tradition. So,
Yeah, but I mean, I would also argue that concept of American philosophy, even antedates America, and its first theorists are people like Jefferson and Madison. It's that it's not just always people that are being read in philosophy courses. That would probably be part of that conversation if I wanted to really look into that. Yeah, I don't. The Jefferson Adams correspondence is, it's a correspondence about what it is to be truly to be a citizen of a republic. But I mean, one of the things that's going on, I think, is like an argument about like what American philosophy is, or what America's self-understanding of itself as a project is. They have slightly different views about that. So like even from the very beginning, I mean, there's this like umbrella under which these people all meet, but they're already at the very beginning arguing about exactly, what the shape of the umbrella should be. And that's, certainly true of some of these other things. It's not like when I say there's an interesting topic about, Israel or Australia, I'm saying there's just like one shared idea. I mean that, some of those I think are even more bloodily contested than the American one.
Okay. Yeah, so I guess we're continuing on the idea of traditions and about relating oneself to various traditions. So sort of after having talked about the American philosophical tradition, I think we also sort of wanted to talk about, how you relate yourself to many philosophers who don't come from the American tradition. Wittgenstein, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, about whom you've written a great deal. So could you maybe talk a bit about how you consider these philosophers in relation to the traditions that you do consider yourself to be a part of? And I guess in particular, does it ever feel as if you're sort of reaching across the aisle, so to speak, when you do write about these figures?
Yeah, again, it's a fine question. I mean, I feel like it's like really different things I could say in answer to it, and they would all be true. I guess they would, in doing that, be finding a slightly different way of hearing the question each time. I mean, first of all, I guess I think Wittgenstein belongs to the analytic tradition. The way I want to understand the analytic tradition. I mean, the analytic tradition can define itself, kind of anachronistically, given a certain conception. Well, you got to write a certain kind of journal article. You got to, think that if you can't formalize it, then fuck it, or something. You're going to like try to reduce it to a bunch of maxims, and then Wittgenstein's going to look like an anti-analytic philosopher. But actually, so are a lot of other people in the analytic tradition, especially that's history, and that tradition depended upon people that came closer to representing things that could be put that way it evolved through those people being in argument with these other people, all of whom one's now trying to excommunicate from the tradition. So you're not really going to be able to tell the history of that tradition if you excommunicate all those people. I mean, one of the things I did do is I, edited and written a lot of material for like a big fat book, which is, kind of reader in the history of analytic tradition. And, so in a way that's in my most, I don't know what to call it, committal attempt to like articulate what the analytic tradition is in a way you can't, like in that like little article you read. So it happens to be at my desk for some reason. So that's this book, this is like, 2000 really like skinny, like small print pages. So it's like 5,000, page manuscript. It contains 62 figures. So that's an attempt to articulate the analytic tradition, so it involves, various people. I tried to do it in ways that, on the one hand wasn't contentious, but on the other hand, capacious, so, so it includes people who also think they're pragmatists, like a C.I. Lewis or Rorty or a Putnam, but they're analytic philosophers. It includes, people who have like strong aesthetic and literary interests, like an Iris Murdoch or a Stanley Cavell. So not typical of the analytic tradition, but they're part of the analytic tradition, and so on and so forth for all kinds of people in convention. And I have no idea what it would be, really none, to put together such a book, which purports to be an history of analytic tradition, and leave Wittgenstein out completely, like he's not part of it. I mean, that would just be really bizarre. And if that's right, then he's an analytic philosopher. So I don't think that's, any kind of reaching across the aisle in any sense with Wittgenstein, but he is like a weird figure in the analytic tradition. But he played a huge role in also revolutionizing it. If you want to understand, mid last century analytic philosophy and what's going on, and figures like Geach and Anscombe and Strawson and Ryle, and I could make that list much longer, of like Austin, of leading figures, in the 1950s. Apart from Wittgenstein, what, the way he's changing the way people think about philosophy, you just couldn't even tell the story of the analytic tradition. Even like you can drill down more narrowly into some area like ethics, if you want to, understand, what kind of criticisms, certain people have of mainstream analytic ethics. You're not going to be able to do that without, Wittgenstein as like part of the background. So I think he's part of the analytic tradition, which doesn't mean to say there aren't certain contemporary analytic philosophers who are sort of have an incredibly anachronistic conception of a narrow conception of what the tradition is, who then look at Wittgenstein and go, he's a weirdo. He's not really one of us. But I think, that's like, the Americans who think these other guys aren't really, it's the Republicans who think the Democrats aren't Americans, or vice versa, or the Israelis who think the religious Jews aren't because they're not Zionists, or the Hasidim who think the Zionists aren't because, they want to be doing all this thing, before the Messiah has come or whatever. These are like the extreme groups. But if you want to understand like the larger conversation, which even makes that point of view possible, you need the whole thing, and you need Wittgenstein, any story about the analytic tradition. So I think that whatever questions we want to ask about him look to me really different than Nietzsche and Kierkegaard. But then what is interesting is if you take a Wittgenstein or certain other figures in the analytic tradition, then they bear certain affinities to a Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, and then that becomes interesting. But not because this is all outside the tradition, but it's bringing out how traditions can't help resemble each other at certain points. But I mean, I think one of the things that interested me about each of those figures is that their conception of philosophy wound up kind of having an absolutely galvanizing effect, I don't know what word to use, on their conception of what it is to do philosophy, write philosophy, impart philosophy. The very conception of what it is to write it, to each of the three of them, looked really difficult to them, given what it was. And so one of the things they're trying to do is try to find like a mode of authorship that's like faithful to their conception of what philosophy is. which means, in some ways, I think if you just open up Wittgenstein earlier or later in different ways, or Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, one of the things you have to come to terms with is like, what kind of text is this? How does this work? One of the things they all have in common, to put it negatively, is if you just take a random sentence from one of their books and quote it in your high school yearbook and then say Friedrich Nietzsche or Ludwig Wittgenstein, that's like almost itself a confusion. Chances are that sentence is not something which an understanding of that philosopher would allow you to just ascribe to them. There's just tons and tons of sentences which are kind of there as stepping stones to work through to get clear about things, but they're not like laying down doctrine. That's like, I suppose, particularly clearly insisted upon in Kierkegaard, where no, he insists that he's not the author of the book, someone else is. So it's like, that's kind of like extreme, insistence on that there. But with all the quotation marks in Wittgenstein and later Wittgenstein and these different voices and so forth, if you're just like quoting things at random, just plowing through all of that, somehow you're missing just as much as if you were to quote Iago from a Shakespeare play and say, Shakespeare thought, blah, blah, that is like the basis of a slander suit. I don't think his family can see you anymore. And I think there is a sense in which it is, similarly kind of philosophical slander to treat Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and Wittgenstein's text that way. But that's a merely negative or privative commonality. What they're actually doing in each case is quite difficult to see, I think. But is internal to understanding what their philosophy is and vice versa. So that's one thing that interested me about them. But of course, the extremity with which that's true of each of them marks them out from other people in whatever one would want to identify as their tradition. It's not like, Nietzsche's reacting against a certain kind of philosophical prose, of his time, and so forth, and his tradition, however exactly you want to pick that out, in 19th century Germany. So I had different reasons for being interested in them, but they weren't, but they weren't, but I wouldn't say that, in the first instance, I was interested in because I was doing a comparison of traditions. I think if I'm comparing them, because they are, each such extreme figures of a certain sort, that they're also extreme figures in relation to their tradition, they're figures who, have a certain kind of radicalism in their thought, where it's a little hard to see how there could be a school of such and such without it's also being a misunderstanding. And so they stand a little more complicatedly to the very idea of tradition. And I'm not sure really what a Nietzschean tradition of philosophy or a Kierkegaardian one is. I think there's something, maybe a bit more substantial one could pick out, which is like a Wittgensteinian tradition in analytic philosophy. But then, how it's related to the aspects of Wittgenstein, I was most interested in comparing those other two would be another matter. I think part of what allows that, to become a tradition and something looks more like a school is by kind of looking away from those aspects of Wittgenstein to some extent. It doesn't mean, that those figures in that tradition are really interesting. I think a lot more. So, I am interested in traditions, and I am interested in those philosophers who, depending upon how you group traditions, belong to at least two, maybe three. But I'm not sure what I was doing, in picking them out was itself just shaped by like saying, okay, now let's compare two different traditions. I think that's kind of more the kind of thing that gets said. A thing that's, said about me, this might have captured some aspiration I had when I was 18, but I don't think it fits much of what I've thought I've been doing, a lot of my life is, oh, well, he's interested in working on both continental and analytic philosophy at the same time and, comparing the two. And so he works in these two philosophers because he wants to bring up the relations between these traditions. And it's true, I'm interested in his figures and I'm interested in comparing them, and I am interested in philosophical traditions, but I think it's hard to be interested in philosophical traditions in a serious way unless you have like a bunch of figures in the tradition in view at once. And then I think you also, you need the center as well as the periphery, or the more representative as well as the more radical figure in the tradition to really get, that shape of the tradition in view. So I mean, I don't think you've really got a tradition in view if you have just one of those three guys in view. Um, um, so 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 I think my reasons for being interested in them are a little bit different. But what is true is I suppose this much is true. I don't mind crossing over. It's not like certain boundaries that other philosophers draw for themselves or others, where it's like you're trespassing if you do this. We belong to this philosophical territory, and if you want to go visit the continental philosophers, then you need a special visa issued, to explain why you want to do this, and you're not allowed to stay more than this amount of time, and you should get back and do the serious stuff here. I mean, I'm not under any constraints like that, so that some picture of how traditions stand to each other doesn't inhibit me from writing about these other philosophers. But I would say, the things that led me to like sometimes write about two of those three together was because I thought of that itself as like a project in comparing traditions. I don't think that isn't how I think I thought of it as I was doing it, or even looking back on it, like the way I'd want to put it. But I do think what German idealism is as a tradition is incredibly interesting. I mean, so it's not something I work on focally. It's always on my mind. Is like what ancient philosophy, early Greek philosophy, which is like the first great tradition we have in philosophy, in Western tradition, how it conceived of itself as a tradition is something one wants to think about when everyone thinks about philosophical tradition. What analytic philosophy is as a tradition, since it's my own, that interests me. But those are the units I would compare when I was comparing traditions. Analytic philosophy, German idealism, ancient Greek Hellenic philosophy. And not because there aren't others that are equally as worthwhile. I can mention some more, but I think those are the three that I'm like most competent, to compare. But then there's lots of others, and I'm and there's weird cross-cutting traditions too. So like traditions, aren't like China, aren't like board games where if you're playing this one, you're not playing that one. I mean, I think they're really interesting traditions, like, I know, here's an example, Jewish philosophy. I mean, that's like a real tradition. I mean, people in that tradition are looking at each other. You can't be a serious Jewish philosopher and never have read Maimonides. You can't be a serious Jewish philosopher of a later date and never read, Moses Mendelssohn and so forth. So there's like a tradition there. But you also can't understand Maimonides unless you know something about Islamic philosophy and Aristotelian philosophy, and that's the tradition he's immediately in, conversation with. And it's like, reading Moses Mendelssohn unless you know something about the German Enlightenment and German idealism. That's his philosophical modalist view. So you can have a tradition, and I think this is somewhat true of anything that American philosophy could mean, include people who are transcendentalists and pragmatists and analytic philosophers. You can have a tradition that cuts across other traditions, so it has certain continuity. You can't understand it except by seeing how these people are drawing on those people. And there's a certain story to be told in their conception of what kind of philosophy this is that's shaped over time. But also, when you locate it kind of historically, there's a kind of cross-cutting tradition that they're also involved in. So I think there's like no Jewish philosopher who's well described as just a Jewish philosopher.
Yeah.
But, not an Aristotelian, not a German idealist, not a, a phenomenologist, not in anything else. That's all they are. And I think that's kind of true of American philosophy too. They're a transcendentalist, or they're a pragmatist. There has to be something else to say about that, which involves locating some other tradition. So I mean, I think it's a great topic, but what I'm bringing out is you don't really have it in view unless you have a bunch of people in view and how they're related to each other, and it kind of with Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and Wittgenstein, some of the things I've been interested in them. I'm kind of interested in their like singularity as philosophers, and so like that kind of obliterates the topic of tradition in some kind of way, if you see what I mean. Not because it isn't another way you could approach them, but it's kind of like not what's foregrounded in those writings. And then part of the interest in comparing them is to like have another like incredibly singular philosopher view, to like you kind of get some purchase on what it is to get like a singular philosopher in view. So I mean, this is a little extreme, but I guess the thing it took me so long to get to is I think in a way, some of my projects comparing those figures involves interests of mine, which are the extreme opposite of being interested in philosophical traditions, which is also want to happen, which is the way philosophers can like so invent themselves and try to create a conception of philosophy that to some extent they rise up above the tradition. And, and also I think it is precisely such philosophers, Kant, I think, was one, Wittgenstein was one, some of the greatest philosophers who are then of interest to so many people, Aristotle is interested in the Islamic tradition. He's interested in the Jewish tradition. He founds medieval, it's because like philosophy has been so completely reinvented and recreated, in that moment that in a way they can be the source of like incredibly different traditions, and like different traditions can want to see themselves as having a relation to it. So it's kind of like it's the opposite of tradition. It's like philosophy at its most, I don't know, fecund and singular, and Heidegger would use some word like originary, like a source of something new and original in philosophy.
Yeah, and I think that leads really naturally into kind of talking in the next section. I don't know how much time you have, so these.
I made a point of not scheduling something after this because I didn't know how long it would take.
This one can be done, I guess, a bit more briefly, or we can take as long as we need, but or however you want. So these are questions about influence, kind of asking you to situate yourself maybe with respect to particular people. So the first kind of question in this, I guess I'll just put in, I'll split it up, is specifically with the paper on skepticism. I mean, not just that paper, but how you think about skepticism. How do you, I guess, understand what you're doing there in relation to other writers on skepticism, say Cavell, Stroud, Thompson, Clark, whoever you want to include in that, like, do you see yourself as building on, challenging, so how would you, I guess, in this kind of context, situate yourself with respect to maybe the influences or, others around you?
Yeah, I mean, I think the short and, completely uninformative answer, if I just put it like this, is, all of the above, building on, challenging, that doesn't feel like contradiction to me. I mean, so, all of the above, but I'll try to make that a little bit more articulate now. Well, here, I mean, maybe I'll put an autobiographical cast. I mean, I think one of the things that caused me to write that paper is because I'd read things in different philosophers who were cared about skepticism, and I cared about it, which I felt was really great and I learned from. And I wanted to have place to inherit that in my thought. But it didn't all seem to fit together. And in fact, some of these philosophers seemed committed to being kind of against these other philosophers because they felt like they were singing a different tune than they were. And there's this to say skepticism, that's, they're wrong about skepticism. And so I was like trying, I think, to build a mansion that was large enough that, each of these people could have their room, and, there could be corridors that connected them. They weren't, just, in completely different non-communicating compounds. And so that, it could all be like one story about skepticism. And so I think I was both inheriting and in a certain way, also diverging from each of these people at the same time, and like trying to build this thing. I mean, just the thought varieties of skepticism already, like, contains a move that allows for that, that there's a tendency for people to get really serious about skepticism. This is what skepticism is. This is like the form of skepticism when it gets clear about itself. And then different authors who I really admired, I thought wrote interesting things about skepticism, seem to have quite different things to say about that. And so like their claim to fame seemed to require, cutting the other guys down to size as not having really gotten anything deeply right. and so, so I wanted to allow, for the idea, there are very different varieties of skepticism. I also didn't want the way that idea of variety went to be the way it usually cuts when people individuate skepticism into kinds, namely by philosophical subject matter. Oh, well, there's skepticism about language, and there's skepticism about art, and there's skepticism about ethics, and there's skepticism about, perception. And those are just really different. And those, the ethicists will handle that. I mean, whatever ever interested me in the topic of skepticism was thinking like, this is like the fundamental form of philosophical problem that is, captures something about the very nature of philosophy, and that will come up over and over again in philosophy. And that one's learning something deep about a certain dispensation of philosophy, if one can get this animating perplexity, vivid enough. I think one philosopher who influenced me a lot in this regard, who I think isn't mentioned in the paper, but in a more autobiographical version, is like Aristotle. I mean, this is just, he's of course building on something in Socrates and Plato, but this is like how Aristotle proceeds. Everything, whatever treatise is, always starts with aporia. There's the aporia of motion, or there's the aporia of mixture, or there's the aporia, and it looks like it must be this and it can't be this, and there's a reason to say both. And then Aristotle starts. That's just like the way he frames each thing. And I just think there's something about like taking a philosophical issue and then putting it that deeply. And I think a lot of contemporary philosophy resists that because it kind of makes it look like it's not a serious subject. It's like your basic question just looks like it's impossible. It's like, haven't you guys made any progress yet? And so, like philosophy, much more prefer to put things like, well, the fundamental problem in epistemology now is whether the reliabilists or the coherentisms have the right account, how we, whether we probabilify these beliefs or whether, and so like lots of things are decided. It's like, no, the fundamental question of epistemology is like, what is knowledge and whether we can have any, and whatever those things are, like they're incredibly downstream and came about, through a certain attempt to like answer a philosophical skeptic. Even don't talk about the skeptic anymore because you think we've all decided he's wrong, and like these are the two going answers to how he's wrong. So that's always something I want about skepticism, is that it's fundamental, that it cuts across it like captures a whole conception of what philosophy is and how to do it. And that feature, what I liked about the people I liked most about skepticism, that that's something they all shared. The people you mentioned, I can't remember all the people on your list, but but if we said Plato, Aristotle, Kant, some historical figures like that, and we had people like like tradition like Stroud and Cavell, Putnam, McDowell, we can make those. They all just sort of think, skepticism is somehow fundamental to what philosophy is, and it comes up all the place we need to get clear about it. And so that's something I liked about them. But it's that very feature of like the kind of importance they're trying to accord skepticism that also can make it seem like really hard to pluralize. It's like, how can it be the one thing that's shared everywhere, and that is the fundamental form of the question? And now you want to say varieties, and so like that's actually, I don't go in on this in the paper. I just like get down to business and do a certain thing in that paper in a certain way. We could talk about strategies and audiences. That paper has a certain literary strategy. It starts by trying to say a lot of things that are in a way involve no philosophy, that are just like descriptive. And then, once a certain philosophical question is only posed, once I've gotten people to accept like certain ways of describing things. So that, what really animates me in that area and the way that paper is written are, at a certain remove from each other, because that paper, as we were talking about earlier, is written, with a certain audience and a certain strategy of writing in mind. And so, that has a certain instrumental character that, stands in a complicated relation to my answer to your question, which is like, goes more to my heart and not just my strategy for moving certain people. I always, it did strike me like a hard thing to like keep what's most interesting about skepticism, people who care about most and see as philosophically central, and pluralize it. I mean, that already like struck me as like, a hard tightrope to walk. And then also I want to pluralize it in such a way that it's still all skepticism. That it isn't just like this homonym. So people are, merely talking by each other when they're having these arguments, even if they are in some way talking by each other. and then if you know, as you probably know, or have some sense if you read that longer paper, the way I want to see these things as connected is like dialectically, certain kinds of skeptical questions can go over into other kinds of skeptical questions, once they're subjected to a certain kind of pressure or shape. So they're not just unrelated. So this is what I meant, my metaphor of the corridors that, are connecting the different rooms in the mansion. So that they can, like a room in a mansion, have a certain kind of self-standing character with their own furniture and wallpaper and everything. And there's a lot to say about each of them. But then someone else can be describing another variety extremely well, and then there's something to think about how they're connected. So that was part of the project then. And so I guess I thought Clark and Stroud mostly, till we get to later Stroud, who I think is an interesting figure, who's I think getting perplexed towards the end of his life in ways that I was getting perplexed, already when I was trying to write that paper. But a lot of the Stroud I'd written up to the point I wrote that paper, which I suppose is relevant for that paper. Clark, Stroud, Cavell, those are three people I can mention. Other people whose conception of what skepticism is very much controlled by what I call Cartesian skepticism. And so I was trying to give a very detailed portrait of what that is, in a very fundamental level where you can see how it keeps coming up and what the shape of the problem is in a way that's faithful to what I learned about them, but also determinately enough described that one could see that other things that philosophers call skepticism, which have a face that has a different physiognomy of problem. And I thought other philosophers I was really interested in, the later John McDowell and the later Hilary Putnam, Saul Kripke. Now I'm just naming people in the analytic tradition, but one could mention other people, like the later Nietzsche or Heidegger, and so forth. We're interested in some, something that starts getting a very different kind of shape, and so to some of those first group people, they don't look like they're interesting questions. It's like, one of the things I focus in on is like the Kripke-Cavell exchange, and Kripke just looks like what's his problem? Cavell thinks, this isn't what I call skepticism. It's just kind of really weird. But I actually think Kripke is giving, in a way, Cavell is very good at doing for Cartesian skepticism, a certain kind of, I don't think what he has to say about the solution to the skeptical problem he has really pretty uninteresting. I think it's just more skepticism. I don't think it's a solution to it. But what he has to say about the shape of the skeptical problem is interesting. It's like a kind of problem that runs through a lot of later analytic philosophy, which didn't really interest Cavell, but there's a lot of philosophy, which it seems like one should have something to say about. At least if in my generation. And then also, I thought a lot of other things. I came to think that a lot of the really interesting figures have an eye on both kinds of skepticism, and they're even interested in how they're related. So I actually do think that what the word most importantly means in Kant or Hegel or Wittgenstein is more the thing that's connected to what I call Kantian skepticism. So here's another criticism of some figures that I really admired, like Stroud or Cavell, is they were all really interested in some of those philosophers. Kant and Wittgenstein, they're both interested in all, for instance. But I don't think they were perfect readers of them, because they had to they had to read the transcendental deduction as if it was addressing a Cartesian philosopher. They had to read the refutation of idealism as if idealism in Kant was Cartesian skepticism. And similarly, I had to kind of read the rule following things, had to always be a problem about how do I know, whether this is the right way to follow the rule or that way to follow, which I don't think really does justice to what Wittgenstein says the rule following paradox is, which is we lose our grip on what right or wrong could even mean. And so I thought, something about what's happening dialectically in Kant and Wittgenstein and the level at which they're trying to address certain problems doesn't yield great readings of Kant or Wittgenstein or philosophers I care about, even though I think those people are much better readers of those philosophers than a lot of people. I learned a lot of things. So there's both something that's being philosophically left out, but there's also something that's being left out in their conception of their heroes. Because I think some of these really interesting philosophers had both these forms of skepticism in view, but were interested in how they were connected and was definitely interested in the one that the other one was sort of blind to. And then as I also tried to give some examples, and I could have given many more, these guys, when they talk to each other, some of my heroes, it was just like personally painful, they didn't get along, they didn't like each other. And I sort of felt like there had to be something to say, about criteria where McDowell had a point and Cavell had a point. There had to be something to say about, rule following and how to read Wittgenstein where Cavell had a point and Kripke had a point, or there had to be something to say about, perception where Putnam had a point and McDowell had a point, or so. I could have made that list much longer because I really just tried to pick some perspicuous examples. Or, what I was doing with the Price and Lewis passages is really typical of something I saw happening all the time, that people have a certain template for what a philosophical problem is. And then if they just, a lot of vocabulary comes up, there's just words about epistemic and direct and the object of knowledge and consciousness. They just fold the whole thing into their template. And so there's only one way to read that philosopher. And so then, this is a more local notion of tradition, I suppose, but in this sub notion of tradition, a certain way of thinking about skepticism controls their reading of anyone they read. And I think then they don't understand certain figures. So I think C.I. Lewis is a really interesting philosopher, but I don't think he's really all that concerned with, with Cartesian skepticism. So it was wanting to be able to understand how all these different things I learned from could all, be part of, it's sort of, I feel like this is some version of the, the stupid, Indian parable where, the guy who thinks, the elephant is long and thin, and the guy who thinks the elephant is really fat and so forth, all have a piece of the same elephant or something. But I wanted these all to be part of one story about the elephant of skepticism, where they were, they really had, gotten the cartography of that part of the larger philosophical organism very accurately characterized. But I didn't have to just choose between them. But then in not choosing between them, I also had to criticize, each of them in certain ways. So I mean, so whenever, I'm writing, directly about Stroud, I'm having to contest the way he uses words like idealism or Kantianism or something like that, because I feel like their meaning is been changed to fit his picture of what the shape of the kinds of problems there are. So I think it's, both to be able to follow these people as influenced by and see them as making really deep philosophical contributions, I feel haven't been fully appreciated, while at the same time wanting them all to be making appreciations, and then also being able to kind of situate them in respect to each other, that people that thought they needed to be against this person because they were for that person could overcome their blind spot and see how that this other person who seems somehow a threat to their whole way of thinking has something interesting to contribute to the project. So I think that's how I would put the beginning of the project that was part of. And I think a lot of other things I've written, I could mention particular things that aren't, directly connected with that essay and don't bear, the word skepticism in their title, are a continuation of the project that I started in that essay.
Yeah, and so I guess continuing in with these sort of influence related questions, the way I have it written, it's a bit too broad, so I'm going to narrow it down kind of in response to sort of some things mentioned. So two people you mentioned as you're talking are Hilary Putnam and John McDowell, and there's no need to, I guess, choose or I don't have an order good, but maybe could you talk a little bit about how you kind of conceive of your work in relation to each of those, right? Or I mean, not in general, but maybe what you take from them, what you find admirable, or in what ways they might be philosophical role models or source of influence.
A great question. A very different kind of question. What ways are they philosophical role models? I like that way of putting it. I think, the honest answer is they each are in many ways, but maybe I'll just pick a few without any, pretense to completeness in this answer. I'll do the Putnam first. The Putnam is kind of easier for me to do at this moment because I actually I'll be glad to send to you. I've edited a collection of essays, which I decided to edit when Putnam died, but took, as these things always do, like amazing number of years to get all the essays together and bring it out, but it's about to be published. But I also wrote a long introduction to that collection. And I wasn't, I suppose, explicitly answering the question, how is Putnam a philosophical role model for me? But I think probably in some ways I was implicitly answering that question, but I was trying to sort of say, like, what amazing, unusual philosopher it is, in the broad. And I also purposely tried to collect a collection in which there's some essays on his work. On history of philosophy is essays on his work. In economics, there's essays on his work. On philosophy and literature, there's essays in his work. In quantum mechanics, there's essays in his work. Because I wanted, the incredibly dazzling scope of who he is also to be marked in the different people who are writing these collections. Because I do think, who today, could work the way he did in all those areas. Who today could you assemble such a festschrift for, where you went to people who are experts that write about? There is no person, that's itself an amazing thing about him. So I can send you that, essay if you like. But part of it is also really an introduction. So I go into his biography and his, his intellectual and academic trajectory. But I do try to describe it in a way that kind of brings out also my sense of his extraordinariness, and his sense of his extraordinariness was part of how he's a role model to me. So let's mention, some things now. That one thing is that I started as someone who, lived abroad. I didn't speak English, perfectly, because I wasn't speaking English all day, all the time when I was a kid, the way you would if you're just growing up in the United States. So I was a little between languages, especially, at the school level, of how well I could write it or read it. Or I feel to this day like my active vocabulary is like a quarter of my wife's, and, in terms of the number of different words I use, when I'm writing, you have a little more time to think about, what word you want to use. But when I'm just talking, and my passive vocabulary too is some word will come up and I'll say, what does that mean? She'll say, oh, it's this part of the, the plant, or this part of a dog's ear or something. But it's well, we have a word for that. So I I don't know. So I think some of this knowledge just comes early in life if you're a well-educated American or something. Or maybe that's just my excuse. But so, the subjects I was really good in school that involved a kind of, I don't know, a kind of currency that you could take from one country to another, and one kind of school from another, and one kind of educational system another, were math and science, And so that's what I was good at. And when I went to college, I was originally, kind of more what I was focused in majoring in. When I first started thinking about philosophy, it was kind of the side of philosophy, that I was most comfortable in, because, though I was really interested in these other parts of philosophy, I didn't really know what was going on. I didn't understand everything that was happening in classes. And I was really wasn't exactly sure what a philosophy paper is. And whereas I just felt like I could always show off my math, physics side, and, get points for that. And so also the first philosophy courses, that I, was really comfortable in, the first philosophy teacher who I think really noticed me at Harvard were the people on that side, including Putnam, So, so that side of him was just, autobiographically important for my coming into philosophy. But then, something I really came to admire about him was that although he had that side to him, it's not like that's, all he was, as a philosopher of logic, mathematics, and physics or something like that. He was interested in all aspects of philosophy and all aspects of history of philosophy. And more than any teacher I've ever had, if I would just get interested in something, I'd just be reading something. And he'd go, what's that? I'd say it's Martin Buber's I and Thou. And he says, how do you like it? I said, I'm not too sure now. I haven't completely understood, but it seems kind of interesting. I'm going to keep reading. And the next time I'd see him, he had a copy of I and Thou, and he'd be reading it. He'd want to talk about it. he'd like figured it out and read the whole book. And I was still back on page 17, but he's like, he's just like interested in what I was reading and what students were reading. He's just like completely open to like, I don't know how to put it, like extending his own horizons all the time. And I think that kind of became a role model to me. I like really liked that about him. And since I was kind of young when I first got to know him and so forth, it wasn't, I mean, it's hard to know what the, what's the chicken and what's the egg here, to what extent I was like that. And I really responded to that. I think there's some truth in that. I mean, I was always like interested in humanities courses, although I was like a science math major, but also, I partly became like that because I admired him and he was like that. And that just struck me as like this incredibly neat thing about him. So he was incredibly intellectually broad. He was also somebody who wasn't just intellectually broad, but he thought you needed it to be a good philosopher, like, so like, to be a good philosopher, like one thought is you need to know what it's like to know something. So, you should know some physics, you know some math, you should know some history, you should know some languages. You shouldn't just be like, pontificating on about what language is or what knowledge is, but not, like work to get some knowledge in some area, know like what a discipline is, or what a mode of inquiry is, or what another language is besides your own, and so forth. And so he just like made me feel like I need to learn languages, I need to take courses in this and that, I need to get these kinds of knowledge. He was also somebody who felt like, and I think really imparted this to me, you don't know what philosophy is if you only work in one area of philosophy. So early on, I was a little reluctant to spend too much time getting too far from philosophy, math, or physics, or logic, because I just felt like partly I just felt lost, in certain courses. I'd like look and professors talking and students are talking, and they all, I mean, I don't want to deny this, they all seem like smart people to me. Something was going on, but I didn't know exactly what it was, and my like currency I had, which I could like cash in a lot of places, wasn't going to buy something here, and so he was sort of saying, you want to be a philosopher, you have to know what philosophy is, and you don't know what philosophy is unless you have some conception of the unity of philosophy. You don't have some conception of the unity of philosophy unless you understand what ethics and aesthetics and moral philosophy and history philosophy and philosophy of language and political philosophy and philosophy of math and philosophy are all philosophy. It's like, that's how you see what philosophy is, by seeing like what, so that's something that, I think is very much my own conception of philosophy. I mean, I would put it, even stronger ways than Putnam ever would put it. I really like this Cross quote from, Paul Grice, where he says something like, philosophy, like virtue, is one. And I think there's something right about that. But so that's something I admired in Putnam. So there's this like youthfulness. He always wanted to learn new things. He didn't want to get stuck. He thought philosophy to be done well, although he thought philosophy was distinctive, but he thought, you need to know what like non-philosophical knowledge is and like non-philosophical disciplines are to reflect well. I mean, one thing I just really admire about him, he's a really good physicist, mathematician. He's really good at those subjects, as well as the philosophy of those subjects, but he really cared about what he called, again, I no longer think this is the best term for this, I'm putting this in Putnam terms, but it'll bring out the influence. He really cared about and wanted to understand what he called non-scientific knowledge was. So he thought, there is knowledge, we have an ethics, historians have something, there's these other kinds of that just aren't, that aren't the kind of knowledge I'm really specialized. And the philosophy needs to understand that too. And we need an account of this. And we can't like make it seem like, and this is what a criticism he had of his like best friend, analytic contemporaries, like all of that knowledge is like second class or second grade, because it's not, it doesn't like conform to the template of like physics and mathematics. And that's something, that kind of like is a kind of other epitome of Putnam. It like, it's like the way he doesn't in any way feel the need to condescend to that which is not like most him, or what he's best at. He's like thinking that's something really important. I need to have a story about that if I'm going to be a good philosopher. Which doesn't mean, like the very picture of how you pick out non-scientific knowledge as opposed to scientific knowledge, I think isn't like, I now think a bit shaped by like the idea that there's two kinds and there's this other kind, and like we need a general story about that. But there's an aspiration in it, which I think was like hugely influential on me. He was somebody who also increasingly came to think when he was older, and that you need to know the history of philosophy to do philosophy well. He was also just like a really curious person. So he's like constantly going to other countries, and he talks about countries and trying to learn bits of the language of that country. So he knew how to say thank you and excuse me. And I'm very grateful to have been invited to give this lecture, in their language, and like show that gesture of, a kind of thing Americans, I think, are often not very good at doing, and like all of that influenced me. And that could sound like a little thing, but it's not a little thing, because it meant I wound up teaching in and visiting a lot of countries. And I think being welcomed in a way that Hillary was, because I learned something about like what it is to like go there with the posture of I'm here to learn, understand, I'm interested in what you guys do. And I'm not just like the big expert, Wittgenstein expert or whatever expert, skepticism expert for America. You're not going to is going to tell you, people who have the misfortune, none of this is said explicitly, of like living way out in the philosophical province of this Polish city, what the big boys in New York think about this. So, I think, those are all things about, Putnam I really admired. I mean, another thing I liked about him, this is connected to a different part of our discussion, is though he was interested in all these things. He had immense technical knowledge. He had all kinds of his, other kinds of knowledge. He had all kinds of literacy in history and philosophy, but he always wore it lightly. It's like he was never like trying to show off. So his writing is very accessible. And I don't think I mean that's a real achievement, I think, to be who he is and write that accessibly. I mean, I actually don't think I measure up to that standard completely. But there is a kind of freshness and accessibility to, the way he talked philosophy that he also managed to like preserve in writing, which I think also was, it's like you're trying to reach everyone you're talking to when you do philosophy, that you can, given what you're doing. If it's philosophy of quantum mechanics, okay, not everyone's gonna, but for each thing you're doing, you're trying to reach as many people as you can, whether you're talking to them like this in a Zoom thing, or even if you're writing for a certain audience, you don't need to narrow the group more than you need to narrow it. And there's a kind of like aspiration to accessibility there, which I think is connected to like things that he had, thoughts he also had about pragmatism and duty and democracy and things like that too. A topic we didn't discuss, but like, I mean, I think the very idea of an American intellectual is a very different concept than like the Parisian or German intellectual. And also one that's harder to keep from seeming to be a contradiction, but it can be a non-contradiction. And so I thought, that was something I really liked about Putnam, is he was certainly going to model not just of an intellectual, but an American intellectual in that way, I mean, it's a kind of a little, I think it was a way in which he wanted to like, feel like he could be a citizen of any country, which is in a way, impossible, but that's something like he aspired to. And so I was also in different countries with him in different times at different conferences. And I was like very struck by how differently he interacted with the people there. By the end of the meal, he learned a certain amount of the language and, how to say thank you in the right ritual way in that Asian country or whatever it is. He's just like picking up local knowledge. With the other philosophers are just like gossiping about, who's going to get the job at Princeton or something, and they're not even talking to their hosts, often the American guests, So I mean, that may seem like incredibly like stupid parochial detail, but it brings out something about, the way in which he's, I think, like saw everything as an opportunity to learn and change and grow and like fill out, his conception of what philosophy is. I think those are things I like really, really admired about
him. Yeah, I think we also,
I knew you had a better what you were going to say.
Okay. Yeah, I think sort of related to that question of influence, in the Varieties of Skepticism article one, you talk about certain misunderstandings that philosophers can get themselves into when they, are working in different skeptical registers, or, the Cartesian or the Kantian problematic. And in that article, the philosopher with whom Putnam is in dialogue is John McDowell. And I think we also sort of wanted to ask you a bit about sort of what you admire about McDowell as sort of I forget the term that Nate used, but philosophical role.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah. He is one and was one, and he was transformatively so. I mean, one thing I'll say is I already, Putnam, I got to know, in the flesh, and then, he was a teacher, I was going to classes, and I read his writing. So, whereas McDowell, I first met on the page, somebody to read and whom I really admired, and then only later, became a colleague and a friend, a collaborator with. So it's like different mode of entry, if you see what I mean, into that relationship. But so he's somebody whose writings I really admired in the 1980s, and got Putnam interested and got Putnam to read and think about with me. And Putnam was Putnam had a really bad, this is just a little side, but when Gareth Evans's book first came out, who was, somebody, it was a book on varieties of reference that McDowell had sort of, partially almost co-authored and completed and brought out. And, it was a large job of McDowell's to bring out this book of Evans's, and greatly admired it. And Putnam wrote a really negative review of it. And then, in the pages of the TLS, there was this kind of academic scandal of the two of them really going at each other, with McDowell saying why he thinks that Putnam's review involves complete misunderstanding of Evans's book, and McDowell saying things about how there's a certain kind of parochiality of Oxford philosophy that he does not appreciate. And McDowell says, they both, as only lead editors to the editor in like a British journal of this sort could happen, it got kind of more gloves off than academic, polemics usually do. So they were both kind of brutalizing each other a little bit, and we're not friends. So when I got really interested in McDowell, and I tried to get Putnam to be interested in McDowell and read these things, it was not like a small lift. It was like, but also this is like a really testament to Hillary. I had the same thing with Wilfrid Sellars, who's another philosopher I got interested, not as interested in graduate school. And Putnam was, was fairly hostile towards and had some negative engagements with it. I, got him to read some things and think about it with me. But with McDowell, Putnam really came around while I was a graduate student in the 80s and became quite interested in him. Which is, another, aspect of like Hillary. I mean, another thing of Hillary's, I'm sorry, I've changed the subject, but I just realized it's crazy I didn't mention this in the answer to the previous question. I mean, another thing about Hillary that just like blew me away, and which I really liked, was his capacity for self-criticism, and his willingness to change his mind, is always being open to, well, okay, that's what Hillary Putnam circa, 5 years ago thought. Now, what do we think about that? He there's a kind of like ego or vanity about, well, I don't want to have been wrong about things, which I just think animates a lot of people, period, and in philosophy especially, and makes conversation, really difficult, because, one of the constraints is they don't want to have deeply wrong about anyone, because they published this really big influential book, you don't want it to be wrong. And like, Putnam was just like totally free of that. I mean, it almost seemed like nothing delighted him more than like, this position he made really famous, whatever his functionalist or something, turned out to be completely wrong. And now he's going to show everyone why everyone who's following Hillary Putnam, circa that period is wrong, and I think that really had an influence on me, I should say. Connect to some of the things we were talking about before about, arguing against my former selves, you need to be able to open up some distance between your former selves before you can do that. John McDowell, that he could come around on that, I mean, that I thought that was possible. It says something about who I even thought then Hillary was. But so he got really interested in John McDowell. But John McDowell was somebody I first knew as like the author of a whole bunch of articles. I mean, a lot of things he's most famous for now he hadn't written yet in the 80s, but there were a bunch of articles that, though he wasn't near as famous then, I really liked. I thought they were really interesting. I mean, part of it, is connected to what I really admired about McDowell, is connected to some things that were coming out in this answer to the question about skepticism. I mean, the way I put it there was to say, it's not really interesting for skepticism to me if you can't see it as coming up in different areas of philosophy, if it doesn't, doesn't capture something about the very shape of philosophical problem at that depth. But I mean, something I really admired about McDowell was he also wrote about very different areas of philosophy. He wrote about philosophy of perception, issues in ethics, issues about rule following, issues with Davidson Dummett about theory of meaning, issues about knowledge of other minds, issues about the past, and what's this, the statement of status of statements about the past, or talking of the past. These all look like very different philosophical topics. And he, Parfit on personal identity. He's incredibly, good at like bringing out how there were certain assumptions that were like controlling the entire discussion of that topic, which were like the assumptions, that were controlling the theory of reference over here, and the theory of meaning over here, and the theory of knowledge of the mind over here, and the theory of, what it is to apply a moral concept that's going on in contemporary moral philosophy. And I just found it like completely breathtaking. His ability to like penetrate to that level and like see, these like deep assumptions of the philosophical moment is shaping these different periods, and see how the problems, bore a common shape. So that's something I really admired about his work. And still admire about his work, but I felt like I was learning to be a different kind of philosopher, and seeing he could do that. And then, in this period where I was first reading him, and then it kept happening, he got more and more interested in the history of philosophy. And so then he was also interested in having a story about, which happened then more, during the years I was in Pittsburgh, he was my colleague, of like, how did the problems come down to this shape that characterized so much of, a certain kind of, modernity of philosophy, and analytic philosophy is still participating in, even if he thinks it's not. And of course, he's an interesting person too, because he was originally trained as somebody who was a scholar of classics, and then got interested in ancient philosophy, and then did a translation commentary on Plato, and came into philosophy through that route. So he just had incredible familiarity with that, which was like a contrast point, because he's sort of like, this isn't actually what's going on in Plato or Socrates ever, so he had a sort of feeling of like, to borrow a word I used before, of a certain parochialness of these modern problems, especially problems of contemporary philosophy, which didn't define his conception of philosophy. And there I think it's very important, and in a way a gift for him, that he first came to the study of ancient philosophy, not through analytic philosophy, but the other way around. I mean, there are other things I really admired about him, which, he came out of a certain Oxford, Cambridge moment, which you'd have to go even further back into American university to find the corresponding moment, which is like really dead, but he knows like ancient Greek, ancient Latin. He knows how to like translate, not just a Greek philosophical text, but a Greek legal text or a Greek poem, and how those involve different standards of translation. He just knows, when he's looking at English, like what the grammatical structure is and how it differs from another language. Languages he didn't know near as well as I did, like German. Would come upon a passage in Kant that seemed kind of weird in the Kemp Smith translation. Look back in the German, he should say, shouldn't that be into rather than in, because this is in D and that's the accusative, and so if we want the accusative in English, we don't mark it in the pronoun, but we mark it in the preposition. I go, yeah, you're right. It's like, I know German much better than he does, but he just like has an eye for this, and so that's something I admired about him, and I think caused me to like go back and study. I mean, I studied some ancient Greek and Latin because I went to like weird schools in other countries, but you know, I got so much great education, like I wasted as a kid because I just thought of it as like trying to pass the exams. I particularly look back at like the Hebrew instruction again. And I was like, just trying to like say the prayer so that, you know, Rabbi was happy. I like wasn't trying to read Hebrew. And then I was like happy to forget it all. It's like, I look at all this education, I like didn't hang on to it, but like he did. But I like tried to like, you know, reactualize the stuff in myself and like, realize this is like useful for being a good philosopher. So that was something I really admired about him too, is that he brought a certain like conception of like what it is to be lettered and what it is to like see the thing you're reading as a translation, be aware of that and have an eye on the original, even if you are not completely conversant with that language, is like part of how you do things. And that's, I think, weirdly actually connected, though it might sound like a much more detailed thing, with the way in which he could sort of see like whole ways of thinking in analytic philosophy have a certain kind of provinciality, you know, let's characterize their shape, you know. You couldn't even translate this assumption into ancient Greek easily, you know, because, you know, the language isn't just going to let you, you know, there's no word for mental, you know, what do we want? We can use the word, you know, we can use a word for like spirit, but that's something else. We can use a word for like the kind of intelligence that's involved in skill, but that's something else. And it's like, well, what is the mental, you know? Whereas like, you know, like philosopher can't start talking about certain things. I'm talking about philosophy of mind, the mental, and it like picks out a certain like space. And we and dogs both have these minds, and so forth. So that was just something I just immensely admired, his like ability to sort of like see contemporary philosophy as like a moment in history which certain assumptions ran through, and then wanting to articulate what the, you know, what the fundamental shape, recurring shape of the problem was. And also I think some of this came from his being a really good reader of Wittgenstein, seeing that Wittgenstein was trying to do something like that, but he sort of combined something like his appreciation of that aspect of Wittgenstein with something that Wittgenstein doesn't bring to it, which is like, as I was saying, a certain kind of historical and scholarly way of also kind of marking the same kind of point. So those are things I really admired about him. There are a number of things I really admired about McDowell as a role model, which, you know, I feel like a lot of things I mentioned about what I admired about Putnam as a role model, I have like actively, and I, you know, hope to some extent succeeded in emulating in my own person. And so far, the things I've mentioned about McDowell are things I've also actively tried to emulate. And, you know, these they're hard, but I've maybe some degree succeeded in emulating my own person. There are things I really admired about McDowell that inspired a certain kind of awe in me. And I, you know, I don't really think I know like what fibers to move to just like turn into somebody who can be like that in those ways. And so I don't know to what extent I can, you know, claim to have like successfully emulated them, but he's just an extraordinarily decent person. You know, you know, there's certain rumors that start about certain colleagues where somebody claims that, you know, they sexually molested them, or they lied about something, or they said something about a student behind their back. And, you know, sometimes these things are true and sometimes they're false. And, you know, when one is, but like with McDowell, you know, it was like simply unthinkable. You know what I mean? It's like, this can't be true. You know, it's like, you know, it's just like your sense of the person does not admit this. And it's not, I think, because you know, and most people who knew him would just immediately, you know that too. And it's not because, you know, you idolize them, you know, it's just like, you know, it's just like not thinkable. It's like, you know, he would just like turn into a pile of dust, you know, if he moved in those directions, because it's just so in contradiction with his like entire fabric of being. So it's just incredibly decent, thoughtful person, you know, who had, you know, and so it was just kind of like a standard of a certain kind of like virtue as a colleague, as a member of a department, you know, what your obligations are to a graduate student, you know, how you think about certain things while you're deliberating in faculty. I mean, also extreme modesty, you I remember, there's like one discussion where people were saying, we can't appoint this person because, he's never had a paper accepted by a refereed journal, by having the paper first refereed and then accepted. This was like a special journal, so that one doesn't count. So I went through and said, we can't appoint this person because he doesn't like meet the standard. And then McDowell immediately said, I need to resign my professorship because neither have I. He just, whenever anyone raised a standard he didn't immediately meet, he'd like immediately point out. Of course, part of his aim in doing that is to say this is a completely bullshit standard. Like, do we think he's a good philosopher or not? But he was also just like never pretended to anything. It's a and these things would like take people's breath away because people thought so well of him that they had trouble like realizing, oh, maybe that's true of him. He was like happy to like run himself down in any way that was like accurate. And I had one colleague that was constantly telling stories who really admired McDowell about McDowell. McDowell would like immediately say, no, that's not true. Actually, my Italian's not very good, or no, actually, I'm an abysmal tennis player, or whatever thing was being said about he would like immediately deny it. If it wasn't true, so he's like a modesty, a kind of decency, which then like reflected itself, I think, in all sorts of things about how he carried himself as a colleague and a philosopher, which was a kind of model to me. But I think it's just very being absolutely decent is like a very hard thing to be. It's like it's not I wouldn't claim to have like emulated those things I admire about the same degree. I mean, there are other things about him like which I admire, which I mean I literally can't imagine ever being like that. Like so one thing about him is he'd be writing an article and he'd just think about what he wanted to say, and he'd think about what he wanted to say, and then he would like write it, and there'd be like section 1, and it's like 6 paragraphs, and it's numbered, and there's section 2. I mean, if you read McDowell articles, it's the whole thing is like perfectly organized. And like there's like no unnecessary word. And it's like it's like part of McDowell's writings. People will say, why don't you say something about this? And it's like, and the answer is because it's not clear it was absolutely necessary to the article. You only say, like, he has some weird idea of like the mathematician's idea of proof, but carried over to philosophy. So it's not deductive argument. It can be something very different, but it's still ugly if you have a sentence in it, which you didn't have to have, and it will like detract from, and these things. It felt to me, I mean, I know this isn't strictly true, but it sort of felt to me like at least 90% of the damn thing came into being with no revision. It's just like, you like wrote the first part, knew it, you then wrote the second part, and you wrote the third part. It just like came out of him like that. It's like, everything I've written that you've read, involve much more of a wrestling match, or I had some other idea of what I was writing. It came to this idea of like its form would be. I didn't start writing Must We Show Weekend, I'd say thinking it's about the obituary of an article. I like realized, oh, this is a way to do this, and I started moving things around. Everything I've written has been kind of like some weird wrestling match in which then a lot of stuff in the hard disk doesn't make it, and stuff that's in the article get thrown out, and things get moved around, and I like wrestle the thing into an article I'm happy with. But I like, and I wouldn't, I suppose I wouldn't want every one of my articles to be so similar in form as McDowell's are to each other. But it would sure be nice sometimes to just like, be able to go, well, here's like the first 5 pages, they go like this, and I haven't completely settled on the next 10 by each. So there's things just about like the clarity of his mind and like the control he has of like what he's doing in philosophy that I like hugely admire, but I don't even know how to emulate it. But I still think, admiring it and seeing it as, I still think it can be a kind of role model in a certain kind of way, even if it has to like enter into the way I do things in a more indirect way, because I can't just do what he does. But so, I mean, those are all things I would mention about him. I will say that, the very things I admire, I mean, McDowell is sort of complicated in certain ways because the things I said about Putnam were like very abstract. I wasn't like getting into the detail of the philosophy. But some of the things I said I really admired about McDowell has to do with like, the details of his philosophical project and also the form of his writing. And so even though I admired it, it wasn't like just a role model to me, So it's a kind of like more complicated relationship in which, I felt like there was a kind of intimacy, but always in a certain kind of way, a certain kind of tension between us. And like, we were very different people and different philosophers. I remember we were like constantly having arguments, like just about what the principle of charity is. And he's like, this is what the principle of charity is. And sort of David saying, he's like, no, that's not a good way to think about the principle of charity. He's like, why not? And then I say, well, because, if you just start by like, with all the things you think are true, then the things you think are weird are just going to always seem weird to you. And that's going to like, the principle of charity is being able to make sense of things you think are weird, and it's like, well, how could you turn that into a principle, and so on and so forth. But so, I did, I was kind of interested in like philosophical experiment and like not, having like a much more diversified conception of my readership. I mean, all kinds of things. Like I was interested in teaching courses on philosophy of film, and and I should say, like, it's not like John thought any of that was bad. I think, he sort of liked me for it, but it was like, so what's the philosophy of film course? What do you do? Why is it philosophy? It's hard to discuss anything without getting on the text. So we discuss a certain article we was reading, go into it, and then we'd start talking about it, and he'd get interested. But it was, it's just, it just involved, kind of much like messier shape than, everything has in his conception of where everything does fits in and who his targets are. But there's some of that neatness I think I didn't want. I wanted to be able to like branch out in directions where I couldn't always say exactly how it's going to fit till later. And I wanted to be able to write in ways that, man, I didn't even know exactly what the form of the thing was going to be till I was done. And also, I mean, one of the ways this really like entered into, I think, a difference between me and him is, though I really admire, his accounts of how all of these different problems in analytic philosophy bear a similar form, I do think I have like a more diversified conception of like what it is to correct the mistake. Like what's wrong with this way of thinking about ethics, and what's wrong with thinking about this way of thinking about perception, and what's wrong with this way of thinking about logic. Doesn't involve like the same compensating move throughout. So though I thought, I really liked his way of like seeing how the problems, share a certain shape and that restricts us. I think, he has a certain kind of like much more general picture of what it is to like make progress across the board with the problems of contemporary philosophy, which involves a certain kind of move, which I realize is some of the ways in which I've come to differ with him is to think, practical philosophy and theoretical philosophy are really different, and even more different than you think they are. And what it is to know and speak a language isn't like observational theory, and it's not like observation, and that's like another thing. And then what art is and appreciation of art is a really interesting thing, and it's connected, and we need account of our capacities in which they can all do these and do all of these things, and certain accounts are bad because they make it seem like we can't do any of them. And so I agree with your criticisms of them, but then the way, but I'm like much more suspicious of like having a template, which is like the correction, which we apply everywhere. And so I think that's a really big difference between them. So I really admire in a way his diagnostic, ability to like bring out like what's causing a kind of constriction in philosophical thought, a certain kind of problem. But I think I differ from a lot in, being much more pluralistic about, the different kinds of things one needs to do or say in different areas of philosophy to then, break out. I feel like the old, ancient metaphor of, illness stands to health is really good. And you don't have a good account of why all forms of illness are illness unless you have a clear sense of health. But what it is to fix a broken ankle and to treat somebody for coronavirus is going to be really different. This doesn't mean like there's like some general way to like fix the defect, what I mean, in thinking. And I feel like they're and even like very locally, like issues like disjunctivism, it's like there's the good case and there's the bad case. And I feel like, we need a really good account of the good case. And there's lots of ways of going wrong, but there isn't the bad. Even like in more local philosophical issues, I feel like there's some difference in philosophical sensibility we have, where there's something I really share from him, I learn from him, but there's also some move I want to make, which is different from the move he wants to make. So, so I also feel like with McDowell, though he's a role model to me, and I really admire him. And maybe this also became, I became philosophical friends with him when I was an older and more mature philosopher than when I was first working with Putnam. There's something a little bit more agonistic about it, and also therefore fruitful about, you know, my relation to his thought, if you see what I mean.
Well, that was a really interesting response. Thank you so much for that.
Really, so yeah, a lot there. I don't know how much time you have, or if there's anyone else you want to talk about, or that you know haven't talked about, we'd welcome that. I'd also be interested, you know, if you have briefer or however much you want to do it, remark on maybe Cora Diamond or someone like that.
Well, I mean, I sort of feel like answering questions that you guys know you're interested in rather than picking, but there's other people you'd like to talk about you're interested in. I'd say you're welcome to choose Cora Diamond or somebody else, but I'll kind of let you steer the car, and we can see, you know, what it does when it goes down that street.
Yeah, no, I would be very interested in hearing kind of similar thoughts. Again, I don't want to take too much of your time.
Yeah. You know, Cora Diamond is somebody I immensely admire. I feel like she is, you know, McDowell and Putnam are pretty famous. I feel like she's really underrated, you know, in terms of how famous she is. I think she's just a completely amazing thinker. And she's also, you know, like both of them, very much her own thinker. I mean, I do think there's a number. I mean, I never really known how much to weight this, but I think there's a number of really amazing female philosophers. Elizabeth Anscombe, Philippa Foot, Iris Murdoch. I would put Cora Diamond on that list. Who like were really underrated. I feel like some of them are getting more of their due than they used to. And Anscombe has like become quite famous. I mean, she's just an unbelievable, towering genius figure. I mean, but I feel like they were underrated. So I mean, I don't know how much of this, you know, it's hard to say. I mean, I know it's not like I have agenda here or something, but I do wonder to some extent whether, you know, being women has like cost them some of the reputation they have. You know, Cora Diamond has a very non-masculine, non-testosterone driven, you know, kind of style of approaching and exploring philosophical problems. And, you know, I do feel like there's something about the dispensation of analytic philosophy that is more masculine than it knows it is. And, you know, and, you know, and so I've also noticed a lot of people that most admire her work, who I know are women. And I don't think that's just because they're looking for a woman role model or something, but I like to get it. so I mean, that's just an interesting side topic, you know. But I also feel like, you know, the zeitgeist is turning and more of these people are getting their due. So I mean, she does strike me as someone who's getting, as some of these other women I mentioned, are becoming more famous, you know, with the increasing decades. There's like a whole bunch of collections of essays on her work have just come out in recent years. And so it seems like she's like getting her due in a way that she didn't before. But I mean, I'll say some general things about her and then I could say some more particular biographical things. I think she has like an amazing capacity for intellectual independence. You know, she knows what people think in mainstream analytic philosophy and mainstream, you know, analytic philosophy of logic, you know, whatever this is, mainstream history of analytic philosophy, all kinds of different areas. She's conversant, more conversant you might think, because she doesn't, she usually just picks someone as her foil or stocking glass, but she doesn't pile up the paper with all kinds of footnotes, like showing what else she knows. But then is amazingly capable of like achieving intellectual autonomy and like distancing herself from that and saying, here's a way people have of, you know, reading Wittgenstein, you know, which runs through everything. This is what they're missing in Wittgenstein. He's doing something really different, that and she'll bring out things that nobody else like is really hearing or saying, or this is the way people think about this topic in ethics. You know, her papers, you know, that are connected, like the vegetarianism debate, or like I mentioned this because they're a little bit more famous. They're like really perspicuous example. That whole debate just has like a certain shape. they're the people that think, it shouldn't matter, whether we eat meat or not. This is like, people are making a big deal, the animals aren't, they're not, moral beings to whom we owe anything. And then there are the other people that say, yeah, here's a way of thinking about it, so that, they fall into these predicates of creatures that we should not harm, and we're doing something wrong, we do it. And so then it looks like we live in Nazi Germany, we're just engaged in the equivalent of like extreme moral atrocities, And then there's like, truthfully, some enormous misfit between even what these people really think and what they write in their philosophy. Because if you live in Nazi Germany and you think you live in Nazi Germany, you can't stand it, you don't, you're not complicit in the structures in these ways, this is, and she's like, then her whole way of intervening in the issue just like, is just so apart from that, so, she's like really tries to excavate the way in which it's just not right about us that we think of these creatures as making no claim on us. I mean, you just have to be a really weird person to have a pet and name it, Greg, and keep it for 10 years and then decide to eat it. I mean, that would just be like really bizarre. And there's something wrong with just, being annoyed by a puppy and throwing out the floor of a 10th floor. I mean, this would be like humanly like gross behavior. That's obvious. And yet that doesn't mean, boom, they're just, but that's complicated. So who do we, what is it that evokes this reaction, and how is it related and how is it not related to how we treat human beings? And, what is the difference between the cabbage and the scallop and the dog? And that doesn't mean that, we shouldn't care about scallops at all, but actually, the ways we care about scallops is going to be different from the way we care about dogs. And actually nobody's ever going to have a scallop which has a name which they treat as a pet. And so, and so she just like goes into like details that just like do not come up in these discussions. And like lets the complexity of the issues come out, and like brings out how there's something to every side in the debate, but also every side in the debate has this like very forced position that just makes it deaf to what the other side thinks. And then like this whole issue then also becomes so philosophically interesting, because it's not like just this topic of applied ethics that has to do with like the treatment of animals. It has to do with nothing else. It's like, she thinks about, connected with things like what's wrong with cannibalism. We don't think it's okay to eat people, but how is that like or unlike eating animals? It's connected with like things like the treatment of the dead. How is that like or unlike, the cases of animals? It's connected with like the very concept of a human being. I mean, I think that one thing that's really deep in her philosophy is that our very conception of ourselves as human involves a conception of other creatures. We're being a kind of creature among other creatures. And that's part of what it is to know you're human, is that you're this kind of creature. And so it's not like there's humans and there's just stuff. Animals are just stuff to do what we want with. I mean, we think of ourselves as a creature like they are, and also thinking of ourselves as distinctive. So she'll both let the distinctiveness of the human be a genuine concept without like running down the animal, completely, because the concept of the human requires a concept of the fellow creature. And then also brings out a much more interesting notion of the human, because like, what is the notion of the human now? And then that becomes like much more complicated in his other philosophy when she approaches it. And that becomes a concept that like matters to all areas of philosophy, what it is to care about truth and be human are not unrelated. But of course it comes up in ethics, but then it comes up in ethics in her work in a much more fundamental way than like, they're rational beings, they fall into this predicate, and so therefore, they're owed a certain treatment. So I just picked like one like little part of her work because I don't know how to talk about otherwise. But like there's this kind of creativity and richness and all this phenomena she brings that you need to think about, the philosophers don't think about, that seem philosophically significant. And then she just has like this amazing like ability to live in her world and like notice things she reads in newspapers or her neighbors say, or things about how, which things are named what in the American South, or things she remembers from some poem or novel she reads, and like bring all of this to bear on a philosophical discussion. All the stuff that kind of gets blotted out of philosophical thought. It's like amazingly available to her. It's like philosophically interesting. It's like, um, um, since I'm friends with her, I know her fairly well. She's like constantly sending me things, but they're always philosophically interesting. Like news. This article we were talking about how, like Wikipedia pages are being rewritten, so that like, certain artists or poets or so forth, are being described as Russian rather than Ukrainian. And someone else will be writing and saying they're Ukrainian rather than. This is going back and forth. Like you can download the Wikipedia page like every 5 minutes, and it's like changing. It's like the war is being fought, right there, in a different register. And what this has to do with memory and tradition and why this matters. And she just like sees this like as being a whole philosophical topic, or like something she'll read about like what an animal does, and she'll say like, so how do we think about what is this animal doing? What is it? Like there's this dog that escaped from a kennel and then went back to the kennel and like freed all the other dogs in the kennel. And so they all escaped. It's like, what's going on? How, it's just like, she's just like, let's think about this. It's like she just gather these things and like, says, we have to think about this. As philosophers, we don't know how to make sense of this. So her like responsiveness to like what is philosophically interesting, like every aspect of the world she's in, like when she goes for a walk, or when she reads a newspaper, or when she knows something about how someone she's just spoken to says. Like, I remember being in Vienna, and she just got really interested in the classifications for desserts, and like, how that showed like a really different way of thinking. And I knew the names of desserts. I speak German, but like never noticed that about them. So like there's like a receptiveness to her world and a responsiveness, and like turning it into philosophy that then like enriches philosophy. I just admire tremendously about her. And so that's one thing I would say. I first got to know her because people told me there were certain things I was saying about Wittgenstein that was like things that she was saying about Wittgenstein. So we started corresponding and like sharing partly unpublished things, articles of hers that are really famous now, but were just being rejected by journals over and over again back then because everybody knew they were wrong. So I read before most people did, because he was just sending me like the unpublished, multiply rejected, typescript. And I was sending her things, and that got us started on a conversation about Wittgenstein, which has turned out to be a kind of lifelong friendship. But as I got to know her and read other things about her, that just like became like a small fraction of what I admired about her. I think one reason she's not more famous is because I think, like in the circles of people who care about like animal experimentation and vegetarians, a bunch of people really like her and they read that stuff, but then all the other stuff doesn't matter. And certain people are really interested in Wittgenstein, they read that stuff, but then all the other stuff of hers doesn't exist. Or certain people have certain interests in contemporary moral philosophy, or have an agenda that has something to do with Foote or Murdoch or Anscombe, really like certain things she's right, but they don't read anything else about her. Or certain people are interested in certain things of philosophy of logic or mathematics, read certain things about her, really like it. But then they literally, I had professors who literally thought all her stuff on ethics was crap, it wasn't really like philosophy, but her work on, criticism of Christian rights really good. Or people work on early analytic philosophy, they just know that's, or and so forth. And I think actually what's most interesting about her as a philosopher, kind of comes into view when you look at all of this stuff, and actually how it, reading some of it enriches your ways of seeing, the others. And I think as that kind of philosopher, she doesn't even really exist for most people. She's not read, through in that way. She's got some very influential work in particular areas that are born in those areas, and then she's like locally famous, but everything else she does is like some other incredibly weird hobbies she has from the point of the people they're interested in that work. So I think that's one thing that's like that hopefully will change, because I think actually the unity of her work and the way the different parts of it, I think it's really interesting connections between what she says about logic and what she says about ethics, and what's like constricted about how analytic philosophers thing about logic, and the way in which logic pervades all of life. Not just like analytic philosophers know to look at for it because it involves a quantifier or a connective, and the ways in which she thinks about ethics. So ethics pervades all of life, and so not just where there are words, obviously ethical concepts like good and evil or murder or injustice, but some name for dessert, express a certain ethical stance towards the world and be able to see it. And I mean, she has and so there's like really interesting connections, I think, between her way of like seeing like what logic au fond is and what ethics au fond is without reducing them to each other, which I think one also gets like a better sense of like what she's doing if one sees her doing it in more than one place. So I do just have tremendous admiration for her. And there's also something about her. I mean, it's a little bit true of McDowell. I mean, McDowell, but they're very different. McDowell is kind of unworldly, but his unworldliness, is like of a certain kind of British gentleman, with a certain kind of innate sense of decency and calm and excellence of manner, and grace and modesty that belongs to like one feels like an age that no longer exists, but somehow we have him. And it no doubt matters that he grew up, in the colony of British Rhodesia and so forth. He's like participating in a moment in history that was slightly out of time lag, even where he was and so forth. But Cora also, I think one of the things I really love about her, and I think allows her to be the kind of philosopher she is that she has an extraordinary kind of unworldliness, but it's a very different kind. I really don't know how to describe it. I mean, when you just like go for a walk with her somewhere, whether it's like where she lives in Virginia or in the countryside in Europe somewhere, it's just like almost a bit like a St. Francis figure. One feels like the birds are going to settle on her shoulder and stuff. It's like she's just like really interested in everything. She's really open, like the way she interacts with animals. She's like really interested, and there's like a kind of openness to her that like people and even other creatures respond to, and she just like inhabits the world in a kind of way in which there's also just like a lot of quirkiness to her. There's a lot of quirkiness to things she's interested in or knows about and says, but then if you talk to her about it, you see why it's interesting, but it's like not modeled on anybody else's idea of like these are the things, it's not like people collect stamps or collect butterflies and like that's a thing to do. It's like a philately. Cora's like invented like a million kinds of philately that no one else even knew were possible. And so there too, she like seems like from another age in a kind of way. And I think I do think there's a kind of way in which one thing I admire about both of them, but especially true of Cora is just the way in which she, the ancients used to say things like, the philosophers are tupos, and that means they don't belong to a kind of person, and there was also this idea like the philosophers are like. He's like just not member. They're a little bit like they're going to seem a little weird. They're going to dress a little weird. They're going to talk differently. They're not, they're not going to, have a big house next to the forum. I mean, they don't all have to be like Diogenes, where they're mostly naked and they live in a barrel or something. But they are going to be, their own conception of who they are is going to come from the philosophy. It's going to seem quite, they're just different, and it's not, it's not put on. It's not to be different or to be cool. It just flows from there being philosophers that they will be, just inhabit the world differently. And in a way, some of those things that, the ancients say about philosophers, when you're just reading Diogenes' Lives of Philosophers, I just don't know anyone in our contemporary world of whom, those remarks, seem to me more true than they are of Cora Diamond. She just, and she's just, in that way, like atupos and unworldly. And I think that's part of like what also makes her a bit remote and not immediately translatable into professional philosophy. But I also think it's like why she has so much to give. And, when graduate students read her, they like get really interesting ideas for topics, which then they turn into dissertation topics, but she just like opens up their mind in a certain kind of way,
Yeah. incredible. Really appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you.
I think they're about to kick us out of the library.
Yeah,
so we should
unfortunately.
I thought some natural
Yeah.
force like that might ultimately, be what decides things, and I was gonna
But we
pretend
really,
that I was gonna, intervene, but I'm glad to see that prediction was true.
we really appreciate everything. It's
Yeah,
been
we
a wonderful
appreciate
discussion.
this so much. Thank you. Really.
So
It's a complete pleasure.
yeah.
It's a complete pleasure. So there was a Chinese philosopher I was supposed to do an interview with now. And then this turned out to be a good time. So I wrote him and said, I'll do it later, and I can't do it this time. And I just told him what it was about. And he said, but I told him I thought you guys were recording it. And so he said, okay, I agree to that if I can see a recording of the interview they do.
Yeah.
We'll
And he said, if you want to see any recordings he's doing me, he'd be glad to share those too. And he seems like an interesting guy. So I'll pass that on to him if you reach that point. But I did I didn't mention this to you before, but I did bargain this bit of freedom in that way. And so we should give him that link.
We will definitely do that.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Conant.
Yes.
Good. All right. Pleasure to meet you.
Pleasure to
Pleasure
meet you as well.
Hope to chat again sometime.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah. Feel free to get in touch with me again. I'd be glad to.
Great. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye. Yep.
Okay. Wow.
That was
That was great.
that was wonderful.
Okay. I'm going to hang up very quickly.
Yeah.